2 weeks later, from June 19 to 21, an enlarged meeting of the Politburo was held in response to the June 4 uprising. Zhao was dismissed from all his positions and placed under house arrest. Eng declared that, Hinterquestern plans to renaissance all socialist discard socialist and under monopoly of international capital and onto the capitalist if victorious. The uprising in Tiananmen Square in 1989 would have meant the rise to power of a Chinese Yeltsin like Zhao Ziyang, and a similar development as in the Soviet Union. It was not a left-wing democratic and egalitarian movement, it was pro-neoliberal. Any events in Tiananmen took place at the very moment when neoliberalism was triumphing in Eastern Europe. Promote and support the Tiananmen Square protesters as progressive is abandoning analysis of class domestic and international and replaces it with mythological credence in the redemptive value of any popular rising despite its content. As I.A. Serto points out, in the contradiction because in power and in PRWCR as such, populism proves incapable of drawing a line of demarcation between revolution and perhaps it would act better to TLW of old Hegel. With agitation of HIST rock in mind. That sometimes courage consists in erring rulers, in defending them is populist who would be bound to Hegel revolutionary could always heeding against TLW of oneism. Solversionai_SM anti-statism, which are ultimately an oft FAC in contrast to the revisions introduced by Khrushchev, which in the end led to the dissolution of the Communist Party of USSR. China's communists managed to stay in power. There were inter-party divisions, but nothing resembling the 20th Congress of the Soviet Party in 1956. Whatever compromise China made the markers, and whenever it backfired, the Communist Party managed to readjust its policy. Deng's comeback. The uprising in June 1989 created a crisis in Deng's leadership. BAL. And of power shift within the Communist Party. Chen Yun, who was in favor of a stair-led economic model with limited roles for the private sector, reversed some of the reforms. Then Deng, who formally retired and kept a low profile after Tiananmen, bypassed Beijing to make his southern tour in January and February 1992. According to Deng's plan, Shanghai would be the leading city in a new round of market-oriented economic reforms. Jiang Zemin, who became the General Secretary of the Communist Party after the 1989 events, swiftly shifted his political allegiance and became a follower of Deng Xiaoping. In October 1992, at the 14th Congress, the Communist Party promoted Deng Xiaoping's theory on socialism with Chinese characteristics as the guiding principle of the Communist Party of China and decided that the goal of reform was to build a socialist market economy. This decision revived the marketization agenda. First step was the far-reaching price liberalization of 1993, targeting commodities such as grain, steel, coal, and oil. By the end of the 1990s, many state-owned enterprises were privated. State sector employment peaked in 1995 at 113 million. It fell to 81 million by 2000 and 64 million by 2007. After the dismantling of the People's Communes, tens of millions of people from the countryside began to seek new employment opportunities in industry and services in the cities. By 2000 the number of migrant rural workers surged to 106 million. As a massive surplus labor force, the migrant workers were forced into IOW wages and harsh working conditions. Sweatshop exploitation became the standard practice in export-oriented manufacturing industries in southern China. The intense exploitation of a large cheap labor force allowed man's national capital and Chinese capitalists to have high profit rates and capture a growing share of the world market. China's merchandise exports surged from $62 billion in 1990 to $249 billion in 2000. After Deng died in 1997, Jiang Zemin continued in his footsteps. In December 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. Its admission was viewed in the West as a confirmation of Margaret Thatcher's claim that there is no alternative to the new neoliberal order under U.S. hegemony. Chin * inclusion in the WTO further accelerated investment in the export industry. Share of the world's total class struggle in China, which Mao pointed out incessantly, is far from over. The Communist Party might not deny this, but they certainly downplay it, stressing the importance of a harmonious society. When private businesses were reintroduced in China, there was a shift in the right. Ir was not only business people who were making fortunes, but also corrupt party officials cooperating with capital. Attempts by Chinese state-owned enterprises to introduce capitalist-style management to increase labor intensity and reduce workers' control were met with strong resistance by the workers. However, the privatization wave in the 1990s changed the balance of power in favor of capital. On the global level, China, reintegration into the capitalist economy provided the system with a fresh supply of cheap labor. These helped to turn the balance of power in favor of the capitalist classes at a global scale in the late 20th century. This did not stop labor unrest in China. Since Deng policy created inequality, deterioration of working conditions, and degradation of the environment, class struggle in China put pressure on the Communist Party to change course. According to the data from the Chinese Ministry of Public Security, social order violations increased from 3.2 million in 1995 to 13.9 million in 2012.23 in some large-scale mass incidents, a term used by the Chinese government to describe social protests including streiks. Sit-ins, marches, and riots. Tens of thousands of people occupied local governments for days. The ongoing conflict between factions of the Communist Party has always been reflected in the shifting political lines of the state apparatus. From 2000-2010, there were improvements in pensions, health insurance, social welfare programs, and labor market regulations as a direct response to workplace uprisings. A sizable Chinese middle class emerged because of industrialization and market reforms. Parts of the Chinese middle class are convinced China prosperity will come from copying the economic and political systems of the global north. However, not everyone in the middle class shares this view. Many young unemployed, marginalized intellectuals criticize collaboration with capital. Some of them end up becoming political radicals. Likewise, China's peasants do not support neoliberalism. The Chinese Revolution was a peasant revolution. Unlike in Russia, peasants were never a reactionary force. While collectivization has been abolished, land is still public. Light peasants are direct producers whose subjective identification and objective positioning could lead socialist renewal. The new rural reconstruction movement, which advocates communal life, is critical of the capitalist growth imperative. Its ecological outlook also appeals to urban laborers, who suffer as much from environmental degradation as farmers do. They consider it unjust that those who got rich first will assume the brunt of the climate crisis by importing food, installing expensive air conditioners, or moving to less polluted. The Chinese encounter with Neolib 2al globalization. 253 industrial jobs have been created for 400 million people. China's economy has become diverse and highly developed. It produces consumer electronics, cars, high-speed trains, robots, and airplanes. China went from being a relatively poor, primarily agricultural country to being the world and most important producer of industrial goods. From a purely socialist perspective, Deng policy has a more dubious record. New capitalist class was legitimized by the Communist Party of China in 1992 when it decided that its members would be allowed to become managers of private companies. Zg at its 16th Congress in 2002, it was made clear that the party represented not only the interests of the masses of the people, but also those of the most advanced productive forces, a euphemism for the new capitalists. With regards to the economy, during the epoch of Deng, China changed from being one of the world's most equal countries to one of the world's most unequal countries. In 2006, according to the World Wealth Report, 0.4% of the richest families in China controlled 70% of the national wealth. In 2006, 3,200 people had personal capital of over 100 million yuan. 2,900 of these people were the children of leading government and party officials. The prosperity of the new capitalist class is based on the wealth accumulated by state-owned companies and collectives during the Mao era. Former Prime Minister, Wen Jiabao became one of the richest people in China, while his son owns one of China's largest private companies, and his wife Zhang Baila is known as the Diamond. These party officials have come a long way since the time of Mao, who had no personal possessions and left nothing when he died. If we take the global perspective on Deng Xiaoping's strategy towards neoliberalism, it was a rational choice bent to the pressure from the capitalist offensive without breaking the power of the party, as had happened in the Soviet Union, and use the dynamic power of neoliberalism against itself, by first allowing it to develop productive forces, and then turn away from neoliberalism, using the advance in technology to develop the prerequisites for socialism in China. But to prevent capitalism from achieving a totality, it was necessary to this process careful. Deng was aware of this balance. The prerequisite for the success of this controlled opening towards neoliberalism was the development of economic base during the Mao era. An agricultural sector able to feed the population, well-developed infrastructure, a heavy industrial sector, public banking, and a high level of education and public health, were all central pillars that have decisively contributed to the dynamism of the economy. After completing this basis created solely by the Chinese people and delinked from global capitalism, China made an effort to partake in globalization, with an extraordinary effect. China once mainly exported textiles, shoes, and fireworks, not anymore. After acquiring technological and scientific knowledge, China is a leading exporter of high-end products such as industrial robots, consumer electronics, solar panels, electric cars, and high-speed trains. Chinese engineers are today constructing infrastructure projects in the global south, changing the colonial north-south trading routes to south-south trade, and thereby diminishing the unequal exchange between global north and south. However, China opening was costly. Deng often compares his reform with the NEP. However, there is a difference between the NEP in the Soviet Union and Deng's reforms. The NEP lasted from 1921 to 1928. It was firmly subjected to the needs of the planned economy and was under the complete control of the Communist Party. The Chinese reforms were much more comprehensive and lasted for 40 years, creating a significant capitalist class and capitalist mentality within China. Globally, the opening gave capitalism a new golden era for 3 decades leading up to the financial crisis in 2008. No matter the ideological dressing, China's integration into global capitalism was a relinking which entailed a transfer of surplus labor to the imperialist center. Low-cost Chinese labor created huge profits for capital, and cheap goods for con. China's industrialization was complementary to the U.S. deindustrialization and financialization, linked by the dollar circuit. Dollars paid for Chinese goods exported to the U.S. are recycled back to the U.S. through Chinac purchasing of treasury bonds. This reifies the dollar hegemony, whereby the U.S. obtains what it desires from other countries with an infinite credit. The change in the agricultural sector, along with the industrial export strategy, forced millions of migrant workers to new urban capitalist enterprises. It was these millions of new workers who paid the price for the rapid development of China's productive forces. Development char also had environmental consequences. It wasn't just industrial production, which was outsourced from north to south, it was also the pollution that comes with it. China's industrial cities were plagued by air pollution, and water shortages were a growing problem. 30 years of neoliberalism also had an impact on values and norms in society. Individualism, competitive mentalities, and corruption were spreading. The new middle class was copying consumer patterns from the West, adopting the imperial mode of living, with its growth of meat consumption, cars, and air transport. Neoliberalism is not only an economic force, but also a mentality that permeates our thinking. In the 1990s, many in the West, both neoliberals and leftists, were certain that China would disintegrate like the Soviet Union. But they were wrong. The Chinese system did not collapse as a result of the global neoliberal offensive. Any communist party remained at the helm, even though its course changed, exercising what Ali Kadri calls the discrete rule of the proletariat. The status of the Communist Party in China is very different from the late years of the Soviet Union. It is much more embedded in the population. With 98 million members, it is organized in 5.1 million urban street committee TCCS and rural village councils, and the party has the respect of the population. About 89% of the Chinese respondents trusted the government in 2022, listed in first place among 28 surveyed countries in 2022. On average, about 51% of respondents showed trust in their government globally. After its encounter with neoliberalism, China emerged as a major economic crisis, an epochal change in the world system. China was able, for the first time in 200 years, to break the polarizing dynamic of capitalism between the West and the rest of the world. This polarizing dynamic led the dependency theorists of the 1970s to conclude that the industrialization of the Third World was impossible within the imperialist system. Ni assumed that a substantial domestic market for consumer products had to be developed before industrialization could occur. They underestimated the development of the product-drive forces that made the globalization of production and consumption possible. The multinational companies industrialized in the global south with the primary aim of exporting to the affluent markets in the global north. In 1976, Emmanuel anticipated the future role of MNC in China, meant to sell Tianal capital by the wage workers of certain then was by of marker associated with such wages. This lack of capital in turn growth and wage ports alone. But except for primary products, and appeared transcend fief of traditional capitalist. In any case, it never MNC, with its own sales network and, in of be the lack AFPRC accessing local it take vantage of exploit the low wages of IHE periphery and the high wages of the center. I have no idea of the relative importance of the here, as elsewhere, statistical all I'll add, if this us. Far the first time the Hevekna's circle world was holding up the development of the Third World. It is rather a matter rejoice in. Looking back at the myth of globalization in the mid-1990s, when Russia and Eastern Europe were incorporated into the world market, capitalism had a foothold in China, and socialism, globally, was in crisis. It is no wonder that capitalism seemed victorious. Transnational capital dreamt of a globe managed by transnational institutions. In that sense, Negri and Hard's thesis of the establishment of a single global empire was the left-wing version of thesis that capitalism was the end of history. However, both versions miss the dialectical nature of the development of neoliberalism. The rise of neoliberalism took place within the world system of states, as an effort of transnational capital to avoid state interference and control the movements of capital. Light effort to erode the borders of the nation-state is one aspect of the contradiction of neoliberalism. Other aspect is that nation-states persist in managing society within borders. Capital is not a system in balance, it needs the state to regulate and keep security, not to end in chaos. From the mid-70s until the turn of the millennium, transnational capital was the offensive aspect of the contradiction. At first, it weakened the state at home through the deregulation of transnational movements of capital and trade, privatization, and cuts in welfare. Then transnational capital outsourced jobs to low-wage countries for higher profits. However, the social consequences of these acts began to change the balance between aspects. The outsourcing of jobs, erosion of the welfare state, and migration problems generated nationalism in the north, demanding a stronger national state as a bulwark against the negative impact of global market forces. The structural adjustments of neoliberalism in the global south had the same effect. By the turn of the millennium, the negative social consequences of neoliberalism began to weaken the political dominance of its institutions. The financial crisis of 2007 to 2008 further strengthened the demand for state control of capital. The balance tipped towards nationalism, and the shift of contradictory balance in neoliberalism became a problem for the capitalist mode of production, which for decades ran smoothly using the global production chain, providing high profits for capital and cheap goods for consumers. The rejection of neoliberal policies and the shrinking size of the world market as a consequence of trade war, embargoes, and sanctions due to our own national conflicts in the world system, hampered the continuity of capital accumulation. The heyday of neoliberal capitalism and U.S. hegemony was over. This meant an increasing discordance between global capitalism and China's national project of development. In terms of foreign policy, this was expressed by attempt to reshape international politics away from U.S. hegemony and towards a multipolar world system. China avoided severe consequences from the financial crises primarily because its banking system was state-owned, and not an integrated part of the global financial house of cards that collapsed. Secondly, China quickly expanded investments in the state-owned sector to replace a flailing private capitalist sector. However, China's growth strategy was still based on exports to the US and European markets, which had declined. More than 20 million workers lost their jobs. However, most of these migrant workers could return to their rural homes, where they had the right to housing and basic social services. The financial crisis was a wake-up call to the Chinese leadership. They realized that neoliberalism was no longer a dynamic force to develop the productive forces, but increasingly a problem in the form of economic stagnation, social inequality, and environmental problems. These conditions led to a reemerging Marxist critique in China, challenging the influence of neoliberal thought. Left or right? The state sector workers' anti-privatization struggles, and strikes in the export-oriented manufacturing sectors, suggested that working-class militancy was growing, and the regime of cheap labor exploitation was not sustainable. There was also growing concern about various ecological problems. This led to strategic debates within the Communist Party. One faction, led by Bozilla, advocated more state control of the economy and redistribution of wealth from the capitalist class to the working class under the slogan of common prosperity. In 2007, Bo was appointed as the party secretary of the municipality of Chongqing and a member of the Politburo of the Communist Party of China. He initiated a massive anti-corruption campaign and confronted the mafia-connected local capitalist class. Bo emerged as the leader of the anti-neoliberal faction. Under his lead, Chongqing achieved one of the highest economic growth rates among all provinces, and income inequality declined. Bo's experiment was met with opposition from the supporters of continued neoliberal policies in the Communist Party. The liberal media within China portrayed war was going on in Chongqing as an attempt to revive the rural revolution. In the heat of this struggle, something strange happened. On February 6, 2012, Chongqing's police chief suddenly went into the U.S. consulate and demanded political asylum. In April, Bo was stripped of his membership in the Politburo of the Communist Party. His wife was accused of murdering Neil Haywood, a British spy. What actually happened remains unclear. But the neoliberal faction of Communist Party leadership had conspired for months to get rid of Bozilla, and the incidents certainly served their political purpose. Why? Instead of Bozilla, whom many had seen as the next general secretary of the Communist Party, the 18th Central Committee elected Xi Jinping in November 2012. However, it turned out not to be the hoped-for victory for the pro-neoliberal faction of the party. Born in 1953, Father held a series of high posts in the Communist Party. During the Cultural Revolution, his father was purged from the party. Experience during the Cultural Revolution had a great influence on his view of politics. In an interview in 2000, he said, people who have little contact with power, who are it, always see through se things but the eye guards during and how people blow hot cold. Polities on a deeper level. In 1968, Mao ordered millions of young people, including she, into the countryside to be educated. For several years, she was in the countryside, building wells, digging fields, and herding sheep. Looking back, the time in the village was transformative for she. He ended up as the local party chief in the village. He developed an affinity to rural poor, as well as a pragmatism in politics. In his dealings with village life, the Shi family was reunited in 1972, under orders from Zhou Enlai. His father was rehabilitated in 1978 and resumed his work as Lihing. China, first special economic in to attract foreign investment. She himself became a member of the Communist Party in 1974. Xi's personal experience during the Cultural Revolution did not generate an aversion to THIRD Mao. Since becoming General Secretary, he has sought to resurrect Mao image. After a degree in engineering in 1979, Xi served in several posts in the provinces. In 1990, he became the leader of the Party School in Fuzhou. From 1998 to 2002, Xi studied Marxist theory and ideological education at Tsinghua University. In 2002, he was elected a member of the Central Committee. Already by 2009, secret U.S. cables sent by Center for New American Security to Washington, revealed by WikiLeaks, stated Xi knew very well that corruption, commercialization, and loss of value had emerged. It was suggested that when Xi would take the helm of party, he might aggressively attempt to address those evils, perhaps at the expense of the new moneyed class. The dream for the rise of a Chinese Gorbachev was eviscerated on November 1, 2012 when Xi was elected to the post of General Secretary of the Communist Party. She had the task to rectify the many problems inherited from opening up. He started with an anti-corruption campaign, fighting the cronyism market development had introduced. Inspection reams initiated investigations of high-ranking officials. Over 100 provincial ministerial-level officials were implicated. These included leading figures of state-owned enterprises and highly ranked generals, who were subsequently dismissed. In addition to this, over 200 low-ranking officials received warnings, fines, and demotions within the first 2 years of campaign, and a hard line on corruption has continued since the Xi period is sometimes referred to as China's Third Revolution. The first being Mao's and the second Deng's. The periods are linked together through the creation of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Hunt, Luke Wo to the diplomat. As explained by Xi in 2013, RRTM historical periods, before and opening up me periods that also major differences. The eocency of both that Perry was leading the people in the exploration and practice of building socialism. Socialism with Chinese characteristics was created in the new Hisup. It created Enclave of China Al-Ray. The system carried more 20 years had decision in 1978 to carry reform and China would not in the GA it is today it is even at IMVE he had a crisis like the Union and Eastern the ideological direction, policies and practice of building socialism in these historical periods were very these two separate FMME at all fu MLW and Tali exploration of socialism BC fork reform and up the Kindigians for TB practice and exploration of socialism alier. Reform and opening up, the practice and exploration of socialism alier refern and opening up to maintain, reform and develop the previous period. During Denghi era, the national principal contradiction was defined as the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people versus backyard social production. However, despite the development of due productive forces under Deng, it produces, according to Xi, an unbalanced development, characteristic of the capitalist growth model, marred by deepening class inequality, rural/urban divisions, promotion of economic development at the expense of cultural development, and an unsustainable relation to the environment. 6 In 2017, She declared AR the 19th National Congress of the Communist Party. What WC now faces the contradiction between unbalanced and inadequate development and the PUPLE's ever-growing needs for huer life, the illusion of contradicted ma historic shift that affects through whole TLNT new of Perry the peoples, to child care, playmen, medical services, elderly care, Lauesen, and assistance, as well as fairness and justice. While overall productive forces have seen improved and in our production capacity leads to is TLNT is inequality. Despite the aft principal contradiction, China is still and will long remain in the primary stage of socialism. 74 decades of opening up towards neoliberalism has left its mark, not only in terms of increased inequality, but also in terms of worse working conditions, especially for the workers in the export zones. The values and norms of neoliberalism have also left their mark. Individualism, a competition mentality, along with greed, have made their inroads at the expense of solidarity and community. It requires a long, tough pull to change mentality. It is not done by words alone, but foremost by changing the way of living in production, in the education system, and everyday life to make the socialist values and norms rational. Thus, a shift toward equality, self-sufficiency, ecological balance, rural revitalization, and the forging of a dual circulation with more emphasis on the domestic market designed to reduce China's dependence on foreign markets are all seen as crucial to China's emergence as a great modern socialist society. Sliding to the left, the crisis of neoliberalism became a turning point in Chinese politics. Instead of economic growth based on exports through America, Europe, and Japan, China began expanding the Chinese domestic market. The growing domestic market was based on rising wages in industry, putting more emphasis on the public welfare system and an effort to eliminate poverty in the countryside, which had been neglected since the end of the Rural Revolution. Chinese workers' wages more than tripled over the last 12 years, from around an average of 32,010 107,000 yuan between 2009 and 2021.9. The growing domestic market meant that workers who lost their jobs during the 2007-8 crisis could find new employment, and CHR growth could continue despite the economic recession in the rest of the capitalist world. Growing hostility from the US, seen in its trade war and technology blockade, have alerted China to its dependency on the US and moved it in the direction of a soft delinking process. Light 14th Five-Year Plan set forward the principle of independent air scientific research capacity and technological self-sufficiency as the foundation of the nation. The aim is to build a digital China with its independent IC chip, 5G, new energy technologies, and new material science. 0. According to the Communist Party of China, the current form of marker socialism has three goals: establish a highly developed and diversified industrial sector, to establish balance with the agricultural sector, and to make a planned national economy an important factor in the world capitalist system. Besides the technological development and expansion of the industrial sector, the agricultural production and rural areas have been reconstructed in the decade from 200310-2013, China increased its grain output by about 50%. From 2013 to 2019, the number of towns with supply marketing cooperatives in rural China increased from 50% to 95%, as part of the revitalization of the countryside, contributing to the elimination of extreme poverty. And it is essential to maintain collective ownership of land, and a solid cooperative economy for rural social stability, which in turn is vital for the stability of Chinese society as a whole. Rural community cooperatives are also an important agent of environmental protection. Whereas the urban economy is more driven by a market economic rationality, the rural community is maintained by cooperative rationality. For decades, Chinese rural society has served as the buffer for crises generated in the cities. Signifying that the government has turned its attention to the rural sector, the government proposed a rural rebuilding strategy in 2017, consisting of I a diversion from the policy of accelerating urbanization and instead giving priority to agriculture. 2. An assertion that rural revitalization is the most creative aspect of China's development in the 21st century. 3. An abandonment of the path of dependence on quantitative growth and a turn towards eco-friendly growth and development. In 2021, she called on China to promote common prosperity. This term is not new. The phrase first appeared in 1953, when common prosperity was stated as a goal of China's socialist construction. In 1979, the People's Daily caltied an article entitled, "A Few Getting Rich First and Common Prosperity, Echoing Policy." 6. Light dethroned Baudelaire also used the term frequently. However, it is now back in force. In January 2021, Xi Jinping said, "Realizing common prosperity is more than an economic goal. It is a major political issue that bears on parties we cannot gap rich TLW to we proxtive the gaps urban and areas, rich poor we should promote all around pair quiescence and personal development, and advocate social fame% justice, fnits of in FAIR way to move in the direction of common prosperity. China is increasing wages, especially for low-income groups, and addressing excessively incomes through a new income distribution and tax system. The government has also pursued the common prosperity agenda with a series of related reforms." China, Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security and the Supreme People's Court declared it illegal for companies to make employees work extended hours and then terminate their contracts if they had excruciating work schedules. Commonly known as 996 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. Furthermore, there has been a crackdown on tech firms and other monopolies, such as online food delivery, car hailing, recruitment, and speculation in real estate. As a result of the liberalization of the past, the costs of housing, education, and health have grown. Speculative capital was allowed to penetrate the housing sector, causing real estate prices in major cities to become unaffordable for most people. In 2017, she announced that houses are for living in and not for speculation. In subsequent years, the government sought to control housing prices and subsidies rental housing. The government has also mandated local authorities scrutinize all the activities of developers, from the arrangement of finance to the transfer of ownership titles. There are other echoes of Baudelaire municipality of Chongqing. In June 2021, the State Council drafted a plan for the construction of a common prosperity zone in Zhejiang. The plan sets guiding principles for the urban and rural income should increase and narrow the income gap. It should provide strategic support to the state-owned economy and prevent the disorderly expansion of capital. The new zone should make sure that houses are for living and not for speculation, and develop a rural revitalization with an ecological, collectively owned, and cooperative rural economy. Finally, in 2013, she launched the Belt and Road Initiative, the resurrection of the ancient Silk Road trade route, building train lines, roads, and airports to connect South and Central Asia to the Middle East and Europe. This is coupled with a maritime Silk Road that would connect China to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and Europe via various sea lanes. In 2017, China further extended its maritime Silk Road to LAR. In America, 39 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, 34 in Europe and Central Asia, 25 in East Asia and the Pacific, 18 in Latin America and the Caribbean, 17 in the Middle East and North Africa, and 6 in South Asia are now affiliated with One Belt, One Road. This project, in combination with the intergovernmental organization BRICS, ultimately involves shifting power away from the US/EU/Japan-dominated North-South hierarchy towards a South-South economic cooperation and a multipolar political world system. The governance of China. The Communist Party of China is described in Western media as a centralized authoritarian regime, seeing liberal parliamentarianism as the only way to practice democracy, a discursive label shared, to some extent, by the mainstream left wing. It ignores the rule of capital over politics in the West itself, as well on global affairs. The Communist Party is on its side, trying to develop a democratic form of governance suitable for socialism with Chinese characteristics and to become more pervasive than capitalist liberalism. This has been a long process going back to the revolution and the development of the mass line, and still has high priority, as reflected in the right of a 4-volume collection of speeches and articles by Xi Jinping, Governance of China. In Western discourse, it is claimed that democracy and liberal market capitalism are linked together as conjoined twins. However, liberal capitalism thrives when linked with fascism, as we have seen in Nazi Germany, Franco's Spain, and Pinochet's Chile. If the development of liberal democracy is linked to something, then it is linked to colonialism. Any super profits from colonialism helped make possible the molding of the dangerous classes into loyal citizens of the state, who were then allowed to vote for parliament, as they longer posed a danger for the rule of capital. European democracy became a resource allocation mechanism, creating welfare for sections of the northern working class to cement capitali rule and expand empire. Within the framework of a multi-party, representative parliamentary democracy, the population of Europe has voted for colonialism and imperialism up through the 20th century. A vote for the Euro-American wars of encroachment is not a vote for democracy, it is a vote for a share of imperialist rents. The Eurocentric universalization of multi-party liberal parliamentarism as the essence of democracy not only overlooks its historical roots and how it is exercised on the global level, but it also fails to question the rule of capital in liberal democracy. It presents democracy as a purely procedural phenomenon and masks the underlying political and economic content, the exploitation needed for capitalist production and environmental destruction. However, you cannot isolate the political form of management from the laws of the economic. China has no use for capitalist liberal democracy. Since China is developing the economic preconditions for socialism with Chinese characteristics, it is also in the process of developing its own form of democracy, more pervasive than the Western model. Socialist democracy is linked to popular collective ownership of the means of production. Democracy means to decide how to produce, what to produce, and how the social product shall be divided. Its essence is not to cast a vote once every 4th year in parliamentary elections, a fear-watching discussions in a closed circuit between politicians and media. Democracy is defined by the extent to which people can control and shape their lives daily, to steer resources toward the betterment of living conditions on national and global levels. Once latched to the institution of the state, the organs of labor oversee each step in the social production and redistribution process. China does not claim that it has reached CHAR stage. However, they are trying. The current Chinese form of governance is popular democracy, as Samir Emin stressed, which imparts autonomy, control of value flows and autonomous industrialization are the principal features of the Chinese development experience. The Communist Party is not a monolith. It has always consisted of several factions with different political lines, changing the policies and being able to correct mistakes. This political system has been superior to the West when it comes to generating development plans with a long-term vision, medium-term goals, and short-term policies. Most importantly, it also has the ability to execute those plans. 2. The policy of the Communist Party must be seen as reflective of the interaction between the global principal contradiction and the contradictions inside China, rather than power struggles between different. In the changing principal contradiction has been the main reason for the shifting course of the CPC against the headwind of the capitalist world system. If capitalism is controlled, it can contribute to the development of the productive forces and better conditions for building a society. But for this to happen, it is of vital importance that the working class and the peasantry retain state power. Light opening up of China created capitalist billionaires, but as a class, they do not rule the gentry. The return of Marxism in the past decade, the Communist Party has emphasized Marxist and dialectical conceptions. Marxism is part of Chinese education from primary school to universities. Discussions in Chinese academia on Marxism are diverse, as reflected in articles in many journals both in Chinese and English. In 2018, on the occasion of 200th birthday, Xi Jinping held a lecture that engaged with the works of Marx and Engels and applied them to China. She ended the lecture by declaring Marx is the thinker of modern times and China is dedicated to realizing his vision of communism. At the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China in 2021, Xi, dressed in Mao-style clothing, emphasized that the CPC is a Marxist party. This is not just empty rhetoric, such an embracing of Marxism from the bottom to the top of society makes an impact. It empowers people to analyze society and develop strategies to strengthen the power of the proletariat. The path forward will not be easy. The development of the pro-LWRI forces during the Deng era promoted the possibility of socialism, but IR also generated a capitalist class which is committed to the preservation and defense of capitalism. This heralds inevitable contradictions within Chinese society. These are to be found in the inequality created by the opening up policy, which still exists, and in the exploitation of labor employed by companies such as Foxconn. 2 and war she has referred to as the principal unequal distribution of wealth and the uneven development between rural and urban communities is evident in class struggles taking place at all levels of society. The Communist Party tries to build bridges and avoid major divisions between the different currents of society through a process of reforms to redistribute wealth, the reduction of the gaps between incomes and regional development, fighting poverty and promoting common prosperity. On the 16th of October 2022, she delivered a report to the 20th National Congress and was re-elected for another 4-year term. The report confirms the course of Xi's policy in the past decade, the pursuit of economic growth, but also the pursuit of quality growth that reduces inequality, tackles corruption, increases collective prosperity, and restores ecological integrity. China 1949-2023 China has been an advanced civilization for millennia, both in technology and governance. Imperialism created a break in this continuity between 1840 and 1949. Neither the traditional ruling class nor the indigenous capitalist class was able to reverse China's national decline. Only the Communist Party was able to mobilize the peasants and the urban workers to create the conditions required to develop the productive forces and raise China within the capitalist world system. By defeating imperialism including the rural landlord class and the nationalist capitalist class it became possible to rebuild the economy the benefit of the Chinese people. In the past 70 years, China has developed from one of the poorest countries to one of the leading powers in the world. This process has been realized without the exploitation of other nations. Li's result has been obtained solely by the effort of the Chinese people. To move from a defensive to offensive position within the world system, the socialist-oriented countries have to develop their productive forces to an advanced level so they can break the power of the capitalist world market to develop socialism and defend themselves in the process in a hostile capitalist world system. The era of Mao both developed the productive forces and mobilized socialist values. To carry on the transition from capitalism to socialism, it was necessary to abstain from the utopianism and idealism that has been a characteristic of many socialists, which then became disappointed by the subsequent development in China. The thesis of the restoration of capitalism in China after Mao is too simple. The policy of the Communist Party after Mao reflects the changes in the principal contradiction in the world system and the development of internal contradictions in China's economy. In the first part of the Deng era, from 1976 to the early 1990s, after the tumult of the Cultural Revolution, Chinese leaders were preoccupied with getting the economy running again and upgrading the level of technology. At the same time, capitalism launched neoliberal globalization, with the demand for capitalist investment connected with the outsourcing of industrial production from the global north to the south. But China did not accept the demand for structural adjustments. The Communist Party had its own strategy to maintain the Chinese national project. If the transnational companies wanted access to the Chinese labor force and infrastructure, then China demanded access to the technology and science behind production. With this, China would be able to develop the next generation of technology by itself. The transnational companies were so eager to rake advantage of low-wage labor that they accepted Chinese partners in the companies. Result is that China today produces the most advanced solar power systems, 5G networks, smartphones, artificial intelligence, industrial robots, high-speed trains, and electric cars. This was made through the exploitation of the working class and peasants. This trade-off, between the extreme exploitation of the Chinese working class on one side, and the development of the forces of production on the other side, was done consciously by Deng. The Chinese working class had to endure the hardships of capitalist exploitation for a generation in order to continue the transfer towards socialism. This may seem to be a cynical position. But was there an alternative at the time? The anti-imperialist wave of the 1960s was running out of steam, the world revolution was a distant goal. The left wing was in crisis globally. The Soviet Union had entered its death spiral and the global neoliberal offensive seemed unstoppable. China needed to develop its productive forces. Not only to eradicate poverty in China itself, but also because it is necessary to possess the most developed technology to break the dominance of capitalism, and thus promote a global transformation towards socialism. Yet by crisis in 2007-8, China was capable of producing not only simple industrial products but also advanced electronics. More importantly, Chinese leadership was aware that internal contradictions started to erode the power of neoliberalism. World market could no longer be the driver of Chinese economic development. China has to change its economic strategy both on the national and global levels. On the global level, it had to reduce its dependency on exports to the US. Avoid being drafted down by crises in the capitalist world economy. On the national level, it had to roll back neoliberal policies and repair the damage done to Chinese society, a kind of delinking following Samir Amink advice for engaging with the capitalist world system on the way towards socialism, of a stem of choices and of value. Which a national foundation and a popular content, independent of the criteria of rationality that emerges from the law of capitalist value that operates on a world. The Communist Party charted a zigzag course in terms of delinking and relinking strategies according to the economic and political developments in the world system. From 1949 until 1971, delinking was presented as a policy of self-reliance, but it was more the result of necessity than of choice. The relinking from 1978 was a reaction to the challenge of neoliberal globalization, to modernize China, and to counter imperialist domination in the longer run. It was for sure a deviation from the strict socialist course. It made China the factory of the world, but with the sequences of environmental degradation, rural-urban inequalities, and an enlarging gap between the rich and the poor. The course had to be adjusted by adopting policies of rural reconstruction, dual circulation, elimination of extreme poverty, and common prosperity. All policies which are putting people needs first. In this sense, the state is rejecting the capitalist law of value. I have presented the Chinese Revolution and its effort to build socialism as a long process influenced by the interaction of principal contradictions in the world system with local contradictions. It has created breaks, but there is also a continuity, as Ali Kadri states, past is alive in the present. It is neither the person of Mao nor Deng who endures, but the revolutionary ideology that charted the recent course of history. Whether Deng's cat was catching mice or whether China was feeling the stones as it crossed the river, it did so under the ironclad fist of the Communist Party. To falsify the structural continuity in modern Chinese history is an ideological position that aligns with no other country has managed to develop its productive forces both in qualitative and quantitative terms faster than China. Most importantly, China has broken the polarizing dynamic in the capitalist world system, which for centuries, on one hand, has relegated the Third World to poverty, and on the other hand, concentrated wealth and power in the imperialist center. This gives new prospects for the development of socialism and heralds the end of capitalism. No small achievement for a political party. Her is a saying that in China, they sew with long thread. In a speech on January 2018, at a seminar for new Central Committee members and other leading cadres, Xi Jinping summarized the quest for socialism very well. Both history and reality tell that a social revolution often along to ultimate victory only by at comparing the road af far ahead of he road. To figure where we carn from, I can we seal where main here is that building in a and semi-feudal society like unantecedent you is to pointed the socialist not thing that is ser in stone, but should be scrn, like any other soc.el system, as a society that changes and reforms frequently. With of form and up. But to understand its formation development, its historical inevitability and scientific truth, we should stretch the rhyme scale grasp it in the TWOLUDION in the world. MTY Mux Engels. Insis of in-depth tigation and study of he basic AF capitalist inherited and abandoned the ideas of Saint Simon, Fourier and Owen He put forward the materialistic view of histoire and the off surplus leda which led from an ideal to a science. Underscore the end of the Second World War, a number were ixun which led scientific socialism practic in one country cc, in countries. At that time, the socialist camp flourishing, Tijitlu are with dil is Teofil Latin American it farmed matched pattern capitalist world, is why Comrade Mao Zedong said that the east wind the west wind strmght. Full of twists in late 1980s and caddy he collapse after fall of he communist peri of the Soviet Union, bore a serious impact in the vast number of developing countries that aspired to socialism, and of them were forced to take the off-cop ng_s paint out in corn memorathi the 4th anniversary of he October this first week vori is final, Buruchovk already begun this enterprise, it does not matter when for what proletarian's country will this to its what is that TLW been the voyage has been the way been shown XL Jinping 275 history always evolves to its own logic great success of social within China that nor will it perish. And that I is flourishing with NVFR. Success of scientific socialism in China is of great significance to Marxism and scientific and to in the it is conceivable that in Tuli, 1F talk of the Party of China and socialist system slow so collapsed in domino change of TB collapse after Soviet Union, had failed for other reasons, then the practice of socialism might again to wander in TLW again in the ibis incans that it will take a long historical for us to build socialism with Chinese C.characteristics. In this long historical process, it is a CL allenge to TH at the N is T part Y of CH collapse, and the Chi to S not fall. SMI at Perry was strong. The Union soulwerful. I long been a generation does the work of a, but without historical perspective, without a due things of vism in differentiating between a capitalist or socialist course, the crucial questions are, is the plan or the marker the dominant factor in the economy? Are human needs or profit prioritized? Which of these determines the fixation of the factors of production and the rules of distribution for products? Who oversees the commanding heights of the economy, the dictatorship of the proletariat or the capitalist class? Samir Emin considers that the period of transition to Svard socialism should support collective ownership of the land, the construction of a modern industrial system, the maintenance of state ownership over key sectors of the economy, and above all, over the financial credit sector, the preservation of planning criteria together with the use of commercial relations, and an integration into the world market, in which economic sovereignty is preserved, technology transfer is taken advantage of, and surplus is rearranged. These points reflect China's policies very well. Future will be decided by the class struggle in China. A continued movement toward socialism will require the mobilization of peasants and workers by social movements or factions inside the Communist Party. For Mao, the class struggle in China was not over with the proclamation of the People's Republic. The question of continued class struggle was central to the Sino-Soviet dispute in the 1960s. In the Soviet Union, class struggle considered over, while the Chinese saw Soviet revisionism as proof that IR wasn't, and a new class had seized power. For Mao, the revolution was a process characterized by waves, Setbacks on the long road to socialism were followed by progress. With the history of the Chinese working class, I believe there is potential for socialist development in China. The economic development successes achieved in recent years against the pandemic and overcoming poverty show the organizational skills and mobilizing capacity of the CCP. It must deepen this capacity and get involved in the STRU hashtag on the ground level. It must to the masses and formulate politics to advance towards socialism. A socialist-orientated China will be of great importance for a transition towards global socialism. Compared to the former Soviet Union, the economy of China is more developed. This gives China the strength to balance the surrounding capitalist world headed by the US. The global military capability of the US is superior, but China has sufficient strength to counter direct US aggression. Like the Soviet Union, a strong socialist China will create possibilities for anti-capitalists through *s within the remaining capitalist world system. Just as the Soviet Union played a role as a strategic ally for national liberation struggles throughout the 20th century, China must play a role in the struggle against global neoliberalism in the 21st century. This can only happen if China resists national chauvinism. With China, new central position in the world system, the importance of socialist-oriented development in China can hardly be overestimated. IR can tip the global balance of power decisively in favor of a socialist world. Past 200 years of attempts to build socialism is not just history. It reaches into the future. IL process is ongoing. Our reading of the Paris Commune, the Russian, and Chinese revolutions has an impact on our strategies, and thus on our future actions. The past, the present, and the future are nor just a chronological series of events. They are dialectically connected and interdependent. The transformation toward socialism is a process stretching backward and forward. The struggle is not just about the future, it is about the realization of the historical ideas of socialism. From the ideas of Marx and Engels to the strui of the Third World revolutionary movements still have a hopeful impact, which drives us to act and realize those hopes in the future. Our struggle should not be led by utopian goals, but by strategies built upon historical materialism. The recurrent debates about whether the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, or any state in the process of developing Chalism was a workers' state or just an alert authoritarian state represent a mode of thinking that tries to fit the real world into a preconceived ideal. One imagines a socialist society and contrasts the problematic reality of building socialism with utopia. No matter how impressive progress is, it will always remain below expectations. Anti-imperialist strategy must contain an actually existing counter-hegemonic force capable of challenging the dominant power structure. Western Marxists are often trapped in a utopian world where the idea of socialism is superior to the transitional regimes and modes of production, many of which have emerged in the past 100 years. Struggling against a dominant capitalist world system. The Brazilian communist Jones Manuel writes, "Nothing is socialist Manzurian, and everything is stare contradictums, the problems, the failures, mistakes, sometimes even the mainly during this of building so, when the time to do a sea of new social order which is where, apparently, the practice always appears stray from the purity of theory the specific applications corrupted in the face of the universal. The transition from capitalism to socialism will be a long process. The transition to capitalism was a process that took centuries. From the Italian city-states, to the Dutch Empire, to the breakthrough of industrial capitalism in England at the beginning of the 19th century. Since capitalism developed globally, the transition towards socialism is also global. Nor a simultaneous transformation, the transition contains many revolutions. The balance between capitalism and socialism has tilted back and forth since the mid-19th century. The dialectical relationship between economic laws and class struggle creates tendencies and counter-tendencies, which interact with one another. This transformational process has also contained socialist movements and states. Movements are a first step towards state power, but they are also a transformative power in themselves, changing our norms and values, as seen in the 1968 rebellion. This process of transformation takes place within the framework of the world system of states. Although the economy of capitalism is transnational, its political system is divided in Nations. The nanon-state is thus an inevitable factor in the transformation from capitalism to socialism. We need the power of the state to defend the socialist project in a hostile world system. Throughout the 20th century, there were several attempts to develop socialism within the framework of the nation-state, which inevitably clashed with the surrounding capitalist world. To defend their project, these states have been caught in the dilemma between supporting the world revolution, which in the long run is necessary for the success of building socialism, and the need to survive in the shorter 2rn Marxism loves puriri martyrdom, but not real revolution agenda report. June IO, 2020. https://blackagendere.com/extern, OVS purity and martyrdom not red revolution 280 the run exemplified by the Soviet strategy of socialism in one country. Historical periods do nor follow one another in a clear-cut manner, interpenetrate and combine over a long period. In the long transition from capitalism, different forms of socialism under construction have and will appear according to the different histories, cultures, and positions of each country in the world system. As Engels put it in 1890, socialist is not, in my view, to be regarded as something remains all in P change and transformation all other social conditions. Instead of seeing each attempt to build socialism in the past 200 years as mistakes, I see them as steps in a long transitional process. These steps have contributed to the transition by changing capitalism, and have acted as learning processes for the forces of socialism. As we see advances and retreats, we must evaluate them in the context of the different stages of capitalist development. The crises in capitalism occur when the development of the productive forces is blocked by the mode of production. The driver of the transition process is the class **, initiated by exploitation, which is necessary for the continued accumulation of capital. However, until now, capitalism has been able to solve the contradiction within the system. It has adapted and rolled back attempts to the construction of socialism. Illis, transition is a process of trial and error, and of trying again. Communism is a practical with a bevy of trials containing the praxis of past revolutions from which we can learn. In the following, I summarize the main lessons from the preceding historical chapters. The revolutions of 1848 in 1848. The main problem for the socialist movement was how to organize the proletariat. The construction of a future socialist society was only addressed in abstract terms. The focus was on taking state power, not on how to use it. The participants in the 1848 upheaval were the proletariat in the major cities of Europe, led by liberal capitalists and middle-class intellectuals, whose goals were to eliminate remaining feudal structures and establish republican nation-states. They had little concern for socialism. The lesson from the 1848 revolutions were that liberals and the middle classes could not be trusted. The proletariat had to organize themselves and not rely on parliamentarians to implement their demands. Future revolutions would not be peaceful. In 1850, Marx wrote, "You will have to go through 15, 20, 50 years of civil wars and national struggles only to bring a change into and prepare yourselves for the exercise power." The 1848 revolutions were social and national uprisings, which led to the formation of bourgeois nation-states in Europe, a necessary criterion for the development of capitalism. On one side, capitalists hate the state as it interferes with the economic dispositions of capital. However, on the other side, capital needs the state to mitigate its contradictions and to administer its expansion. Capitalism builds its superstructure as a world system of national states. The imperialist dimension of capitalism divided this world system into a center of capitalist nation-states and a periphery of colonies. The struggle for the establishment of nation-states and socialism has often been interwoven because the nation-state is the modern economic and political unit. Thus, the transition towards socialism has to go through the nation-state. Nationalism can be progressive or reactionary, depending on the classes involved and the position of the nation in question within the global order. There is a difference between nationalism espoused by an imperialist nation and the national of an oppressed one. The internationalism promoted in 1848 by Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, is the conviction that the class position is more important than the national identity in the consciousness of the proletariat %IAT. Unfortunately, this has not always been the case. Imperialism weakened class identity and strengthened nationalism. Any current wave of nationalism in Europe and North America is reactionary, and utilized RO defend privileges. But this does nor make the SRRT* for national independence reactionary per se the national liberation stru #fought. Against imperialism are still progressive see, for example, the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. The struggle for national sovereignty will continue to factor into the for socialism. Capitalism will not end simultaneously in all COVNAs of the world and make way for socialism. It will come one after the other in a worldwide star. Additionally, socialism will nor be the same in all countries. There will be internal conflicts as well as conflicts between countries. The revolutions of 1848 revealed that the globalization of socialism requires national liberation to undermine the global capitalist system. The Paris Commune was the first explicit socialist uprising. The communards proved that a conflict between capitalist nation-states could be used to bring a national class struggle to a head. Social tensions grew due to the hunger, unemployment, and overall misery caused by the Franco-GW Man War. A revolutionary situation emerged, and the communards seized the opportunity. It was a self-organized initiative from below and a pluralist movement, in which a range of supporters participated, from Proudhon to Marx and the First International to libertarians and Jacobins to Blanquists and social republicans. The representatives of the Commune were democratically elected in their neighborhoods and subjected to the permanent control of their popular base. However, the leadership turned out not to be effective. There was no coordinated strategy on how to mobilize the rest of France or how to defend and develop the revolution. They also lacked an ability to manage production in Paris. Factories were handed over to the workers without a common plan on how to carry out the production and distribution of goods. The Commune is the first case in which the proletariat assumed the task of transforming society. Based on the experience of the Commune, Marx concluded that the bourgeois state must not only be conquered, but broken, and a new kind of state constructed. The communards managed to rake power in Paris, nor France. The uprising was put to an end when the Germans retreated and French troops could turn their attention to the communist rebels. Why did the Germans ease their military pressure on France at that moment? The answer is simple: they did not want Paris to set a revolutionary example which could spread to Germany. The Paris Commune revealed the need to defend socialist revolutions in a sea of capitalist states. The split of the Second International The growing split in the Second International represented the rise of reformism within the socialist movement in Europe in the form of social democratic parties. A dynamic and growing national capitalism means a bigger cake to share, hence the Social Democrats' support of colonialism. The value transfer from the colonies solved the contradiction between expanded production and consumption in the center, as IR provided the basis for a rising wage level. Through accommodating reformism, capitalism strengthened itself, like a virus adapting to weak medicine. European reformism divided the global proletariat, but it also had severe consequences for the center. Social Democrats' support for colonialism meant support for inter-imperialist rivalry. Social Democrats supported the build-up of their national states military, leading up to the First World War. Social Democrats also led the repression of the Spartacist uprising in Germany after the war. Instead of trying to transform capitalism, social democratic reformist economic policy pulled capitalism out of crises in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Social Democrats declined an alliance with communists against fascism in the 1930s, facilitating the rise of Nazi Germany. Social Democrats were prominent anti-communists during the Cold War, and continue to be supporters of NATO and US attempts to uphold global hegemony. The Social Democrats represent Western working-class commitment to imperialist wars in order to protect these privileges. As Ali Kadri observes, liberal originate in conditions rather than a cut from profits a share from the sphere of circulation. Reform is the payoff farewell. To learning the lessons of collaboration with Social Democrats is still relevant. In spite of the historical lessons, many on the mainstream left still believe that Social Democrats are an ally in the for socialism and that social democratic capitalist welfare states are a step towards socialism, as the U.S. Senator Bernie Sanders proclaims. German Rev 0 La 10 and the German Revolution was a spontaneous, messy affair, lacking unity in action. If you do nor know where you are heading, there is no road forward. The indecisiveness of the revolutionaries gave the reactionary forces time to gather strength and crush the revolution. The result might have been different if the revolutionaries had had solid strategy and coordinated leadership. The defeat of the German Revolution was a turning point in the struggle between capitalism and socialism on the global level. Had it succeeded, other European countries might have followed the revolutionary track, placing the Soviet Union and world revolution in a more favorable position. Instead, the development of fascism, followed by liberal capitalist welfare states in Western Europe, created a secure center for capitalism and prolonged its lifespan. The German uprising was the last revolutionary attempt in the center and the for socialism then moved to the periphery. Russian Revolution Lenin's answer to the question how to escape defeat was years of preparation. 16 years before the revolution, Lenin wrote What is ROB done? Insisting Char a vanguard party of dedicated revolutionaries spread Marxist ideas among the workers. The October Revolution was well planned, led by Central Command, and executed like a military operation more than a spontaneous mass uprising. The Bolshevik Vanguard Party was an effective instrument in carrying out the revolution and waging a civil war but was less successful in handling political differences within the party while constructing a state to build socialism. When the revolution failed to occur in the advanced Western European countries, the Soviet Union stood alone in its own form of state capitalism in an attempt to create economic preconditions for socialism in a hostile world. Socialism from utopia to reality. As attempts to build socialism developed throughout the 20th century, there emerged a gap between the ideals of socialism and the reality of actually existing socialism. The nation, the state, the market, inequity, and religion did not wither away. Any idealist socialist idea of the withering away of the state was contradicted by the practice of socialist revolutions building strong states called statism by its critics. State building was a defense mechanism against the surrounding capitalist world system, but it also created tension between the other socialist states scattered in the world system, rather than creating a community free of tensions. Nationalism played a decisive role in the dissolution of the socialist camp. In 1948, there was a split between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia. In interviews given shortly before his death in 1980, Tito acknowledged that what provoked the split with Stalin's Soviet Union in 1948 was the national question. The opposition of Yugoslav socialist self-management to Soviet state planning had merely served to justify Belgrade's defiant stance in the 1960s. A split between the Soviet Union and China culminated in a bloody incident on the Sino-Soviet border in 1969. In the beginning of the 1970s, Mao designated the Soviet Union as the most dangerous imperialist power in the world system. In 1989, when Deng met Gorbachev in Beijing, he explained that the reason for the split was the attitude adopted by the Soviet Union. When victory in the World War was in sight, the United States, Britain, Smiat in Yalta ing up of in among them. The detriment of China's interests. As soon as the People's Republic of China was founded. The threat from the United States. Glaring examples were the Korean War and the VWT and WSMI Union us with us pay for them. Half price in the relations deteriorated, and China was with the 1960s. The Soviet Union strengthened its military along the Chim SMI at 1963 when a delegation to negotiations broke. It was because of ideological WC no longer chink. Everything we said at that time was right. Basic was that the Chinese not treaty felt in 1989, IR was roulette to run the page for the Soviet Union. 3 years later, Fidel Castro, a firm supporter of internationalism all his life, concluded that, we, socialists, made a mistake in underestimating the strength of nationalism. In the Slate and Revolution, written a few months before the October Revolution, Lenin still believed that the withering away of the state was possible. However, in Better Fewer, Better, written in 1923, he moved away from the language of withering and instead insisted on the need to improve our state apparatus, create a republic that is really worthy of the name of Soviet and socialist, sovereign and privileged nations and an overwhelming majority of non-sovereign war. Rancor and hatred, we want a voluntary union of nations, a union which of by confidence. On a clear of brotherly unity. On we musr, therefore, strive persistently for the unity of nations and ruthlessly suppress everything that to divide. In doing so we be negent. Make to of d_and d what he o fall _ toplish is disunite the workers af different nationalities, to evoke dismast, to disrupt a close international uf the whenever the in this of is are. The specific reason for the letter was a conflict between the communist parties of Russia and Ukraine on whether Ukraine should be an independent state, or it should pursue an amalgamation of Ukraine with Russia. Eichmann continued his letter to the Ukrainian Communist Party with the words, C.Nists of Ukraine must be persistent. Stubborn concerted effort foil nationalist machinations of the bourgeoisie and vanquish nationalist prejudice of every kind and set the working people of THX and of a really solid of the of in fight SMIT for the of the yoke of the landowners and cap _s. And for a federal Soviet republic. The change from headquarters of world revolution to socialism in one country a few years later signaled the passage from internationalism to nationalism in Soviet policy. When Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Ukrainian nationalists took the opportunity to form a Ukrainian Stare, which, as stated in the text ACR of Proclamation of Ukrainian Statehood, will work closely with the National Socialist Greater Germany, under the leadership of its Adolf Hitler, which is forming a new order in. However, Russian patriotism defeated Hitler's plan to colonize and enslave the peoples of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. Lausen concludes, to summarize, the revolutionary class struggle which, should have inaugurated with ring or state and nation, witnessed thx of a patriotism that state and from a Harry it seems that a future socialist world will consist of an assembly of nations developing socialism with different national characteristics, and moving from this stage towards a single world Soviet republic envisioned by Lenin. It has become a condition of an advanced socialism, in a world system with so many states in possession of an arsenal of nuclear weapons which can destroy the world, and inequality, ecological and climate problems that need a global solution. Capitalist methods in socialist development. Another violation of socialist ideals by actually existing socialism is the use of capitalist methods in the development of the productive forces, from the NEP to Denism. The revolutionary movements of FIAN entrusted their economic development to proletarian sacrifice and heroic Stakhanovism as a driver for economic development, but this was transient. Bertolt Brecht said, in his play Galileo, "Blessed are the people that need no heroes." Two heroics are required for the transition from a state of emergency to some kind of normality, and thus should only be used to the extent that they render themselves superfluous. A market economy has, to a certain extent, existed in all attempts to build socialism. Again, if one cringes at this statement, it illustrates a discrepancy between ideals and reality. According to the theory of socialism, market forces belong to capitalism, and planning belongs to socialism. But in reality, as socialism arose in the semi-feudal peripheries with less developed capitalism, in order to revive the productive apparatus of such a country, the market had to be expanded. Market forces can be used as a dynamic factor in certain sectors, such as food production and products, but must be ensconced within a planned economy, where the strategic basic industry is governed by and for workers. The communist movement did not manage to develop an undead% standing which might bridge the ideals of socialism of the early 19th century with the practical attempts to construct socialism in the 20th century. The disappointments of the result of actually existing socialism, and the inability to remold and even erase the stare, nation, religion, market, inequality, and so forth, made a decisive contribution to the general crises of socialism in the past decades. In the intensive and dramatic struggle for socialism in the 20th century, the ideals of socialism, according to Lauesen, like a kind of stru% with cessive weight and on the eve of its page%, the condition of real socialism in Eastern Europe was one of sti on. One of the tasks today is to draw conclusions from the experience of socialist construction in the past and develop it into a theory and strategy for the transition to socialism in this century. It is not a revival ortion of the old socialist ideals, but an attempt to turn them into practice. This requires specifying that the socialist mode of production is not an ideal utopia, it is a realistic solution to the problems of capitalism. The task is to develop a praxis of societal management. How do we produce, divide, and consume the social product to solve global inequality and ecological problems? National and international inequality in building socialism. When the hopes of an anti-capitalist revolution in Europe vanished, the Bolsheviks realized that the inequality of nations was a problem as profound as the inequality of classes. In building socialism, they had to deal with both problems. As a nation on the periphery, the Soviet Union was far behind the more advanced countries. Ixnan emphasized, you must remember our Soviet land is impoverished for many years of trial and suffering, and no socialist France, socialist England as na which lap with their highly developed XD technology, highly industry. Chat in mind. We must remember that AC present all their highly developed technology and their highly developed industry to the capitalists, who are fighting us. We remember that we stain in everyday effort. We shall go owing to the present the whole world is faster we while capitalist world is its forces a guy us is how thx matter stids. See to it that to strength learning state. Only then shall WC be able to large-scale industry. Z. Lenin encapsulated the aims of the October Revolution as electrification, industrialized working classes, were also included oppressed peoples as revolutionary subjects. Much to the chagrin of the Western, the reconfiguring of revolutionary classes matched the concrete conditions of the imperialist epoch and had great importance for the development of communism in China and in the Third World in general. In turn, the possibility of a successful transition towards socialism will be limited if it only takes place in one country. There has never been one socialist country at any point in history. Not in the Soviet Union nor China or elsewhere. A transfer from capitalism to socialism has to involve the majority of states in the world system, hence the need for internationalism in the socialist movement. Despite the call, proletarians of all countries, unite. In the Communist Manifesto, nationalism has had a strong grip on the socialist movement. The Second International was split between the social democratic emphasis on citizenship and the nation-state as the framework for developing socialism. While the communist faction insist on class struggle and the world revolution as a condition for the development of socialism. Following the foundation of the Comintern in 1919, class struggle was framed as a binary between a unified global proletariat and capital. Statutes approved by the Second Congress of Comintern on August 4, 1920 state that, of is RL, and National Communist International in fact and in be single communist party of the entire world. The parties working in the Fifth Congress in 1924, now led by Stalin, called for the creation of a homogeneous Bolshevik World Party. The World Party of Leninism must be strongly fused. AOT by mechanical discipline, by unity of will and action every party must give IRS4VS to the international leadership. It be brought home to the broadest in epoch IC of the working can be won only if they from one center and in an IINL but the civil war in China in the 1930s, and fascism in Europe, vila that conflicts could assume the most diverse configurations with multiple contradictions involving different class alliances and national stru hashtag. The pure proletariat capitalist class rarely existed. Later, in the 1930s, the Soviet Union itself changed its emphasis on the world revolution to the nationalist socialism in one country. The organizational model of the Comintern proved inadequate to accommodate this complexity of struggles and was finally dissolved by Stalin in 1943 to avoid antagonizing his capitalist allies during World War XI. Since then, we have lacked effective intimational coordination of the struggle for socialism, not necessarily the World Communist Party envisioned in 1919, but even coordination of struggle on the national level in a global perspective. The consequence of the lack of an international has been significant. The cooperation between the different national liberation movements and the newly independent states could have been more effective. On top of this, the split between the Soviet Union and China made it much easier for the US to terminate the revolutionary wave during the long 60s. A more recent attempt to develop transnational cooperation between socialist movements has been the World Social Forum. The enthusiasm was great during the first meeting in 2001, however. The open space method in meetings, and its horizontal structure, made it impossible to move from talking to action. A little less conversation, a little more action, please you. The experience of former internationals is that nationalism has been a Trojan horse that has divided the global proletariat. To avoid this, it is important to emphasize that movements on the national level must take a global perspective on their struggles. Production is organized in globally integrated chains. Commodities are traded on a highly integrated world market. The global contradictions influence the outcome of national struggles. Our struggles must contribute to pushing the principal contradiction in a direction that favors the transformation towards but how should such an international struggle be coordinated today? The Comintern was established by rather uniform communist parties, with the backing of the first socialist state, and with the esteem of Lenin. The situation today is quite different. While socialist and fragmented and divided into a multitude of politicalist movements are lines and issues. A new international have not been struck as a master plan from above as in 1919. It must be built from below. It requires each organization and movement have the global perspective prioritized in their strategy. Developing transnational networks of action. In that way, it is possible to establish transnational organizations of workers in global production chains, peasant movements, indigenous/oppressed people, anti-imperialists, climate movements, and so on. These sub-internationals could then be coordinated into more holistic internationals, again focusing on unified action. With this common global perspective in mind, this process can be initiated here and now by any organization, from different locations and issues merging into more formalized forms of coordination and institutions. The national liberation struggle during the long 1900s from around 1965 to 1975, the contradiction between U.S. imperialism and the anti-imperialist movements from Vietnam to Nicaragua was the principal contradiction in the world. Some of the movements were victorious, establishing pro-socialist states. However, the newly independent 32 a reference to lyrics in an Elvis Presley song released in 1968. 296 The Third World had economies that had been adapted to imperialist needs during colonization. Economic liberation proved much more difficult than attaining political independence. The national liberations through hashtag were not able to unite in practical, coordinated internationalism. A common front against the imperialist system, which would have been necessary to topple it, was never established. By the mid-1970s, despite the victories in Vietnam and the Portuguese African colonies, anti-imperialism began to wane, and neoliberalism was on its way. An example of this shift is the change policy of the African National Congress in South Africa. From the 1960s to the LAR 1980s, the ANC was committed to socialism. IR had close connections to the South African Communist Party and the Soviet Union. Accordingly, the ANC was labeled as a communist terror organization by the West. However, when Nelson Mandela was elected president in 1994 and the ANC became the ruling party in South Africa, socialism was gone. The ANC did not change the class character of the stare, they were subsumed by neoliberalism. However, this was contrary to the Chinese strategy of using neoliberalism for their own purpose to the benefit of the proletariat. Mandela changed from prisoner to president, and the policy of the ANC changed from socialist to neoliberal capitalism. No wonder Bill Clinton and other Western leaders celebrated the inauguration of Mandela. This is not a know-it-all critique, it is simply an assessment of how strong neoliberal globalization and U.S. hegemony were at the time. Even South Africa, with developed productive forces and rich natural resources, would have struggled to pursue socialist transformation in the I-90s. Mozambique, Angola, Guinea-Bissau and Zimbabwe have also not had much success. However, it was not that the ANC, Frelimo, MPLA, PAIG, and ZANU made poor choices which prevented them from building socialism. Rather, it was the world system that limited their choices on the path toward independence at the time. China: How to build socialism. A lesson from the Chinese experience is that you cannot copy revolution's additional historical lessons 297 from one context or another. On the advice from the Comintern, the Chinese communists prioritized mobilizing the urban proletariat and allied with the bourgeois nationalist Kuomintang. This strategy ended in disaster in Shanghai in 1927. Instead, following Lenin's demand for a concrete analysis of a concrete situation, the Communist Party relied on the peasants and lumpen proletariat to lead the revolution. Based on their praxis and specific analysis, the Communist Party developed its military strategy, the people protracted war and guerrilla tactics. Marxism, as the praxis of change, is not encapsulated in its application in Russia, China, or any other country, movement, or individual. The praxis of Marxism is conditioned and limited by the circumstances in which it works. Marxism embodies all the analysis, praxis, and lessons learned in the course of its development. Marxism is a living and constantly developing synthesis of theory and praxis. The Chinese communists had a different perception of the post-revolutionary period than the Soviets. They have not at any point, as Stalin did in 1936, declared that socialist construction has been completed. In the perception of the Communist Party of China, the transformation to socialism is a much longer process in which the class SRRT* continues. It requires several transformations of the superstructure. The Chinese communists have mapped their own winding road towards socialism with Chinese characteristics in the same way, as a precondition for success. Other attempts to build socialism have to analyze the specific national conditions during the transition process. For example, in Latin America, the development of socialism has Cuban, Venezuelan, or Cayapan characteristics. Similarly, we might see the development of socialism with special Palestinian or South African characteristics, and so on. Another lesson from the Chinese experience is the handling of the contradiction between the development of the productive forces and the development of a socialist mode of production. To move ahead, there is a need to develop the productive forces beyond the need to defeat poverty. At the same time, there is also the need to change the values and norms of the past into socialist values of community and solidarity, both on the individual level and in institutions of government. Humans produce and consume differently under particular social relations, which necessarily affects their consciousness. Under capitalist relations of production, workers are fragmented, degraded, and alienated. Capitalist market creates a selfish and competitive mentality. In the socialist mode of production, it is different. Marx writes in Capital, when numerous workers work together side by side in accordance with a plan, whether in the same process, or in different per connected. This form of labor is do wc havenen of the im lividual. By of but the creation of a productive which is intrinsically one. When the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality, and the capabilities of his. There is an interregnum between capitalism and socialism, in which elements of the old interact, and collide, with the new. As Marx describes, a communist society. Not on its foundations. But, on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is Rus in every respect, and intellectually, still with the birth marks of old society fm it neither communist nor capitalist elements exist in pure form. Cuba has, much like China, been caught between capitalism and socialism, in what Castro has called the struggle to the death between the future and the past. Future must subordinate the elements inherited from the past, but the new system is inevitably defective as it emerges from capitalism. It is no mystery why actually existing socialism has difficulties in the development required to move to socialism for real. For Che Guevara, the central need was to build the future. We understand the capitalist old categories are rearranged for a time and that the length or this period cannot be but the bonds in order to move quickly into the new stage. To do this, Che warned against relying solely on material incentives. The temptation is very great. Fallow Baron crack af material interest as the lever with which to do deny the altwiugwi to you the main tendency in opinion. Eliminate fast as possible 10 eliminate conditions for their existence, he pipe that be achieved with the help dull to us by profuxibility. Individual material interest as a etc., can into blind alley. And you wind up rhcrc afrayer having gravelled a long distance with many and it is to figure out just where took the W2 that is why Che stressed that, ta construct communism the new man has to be created as well as the moral base. At times of danger, it is easy to moral to maintain it to deopa whereby values are acquired and society as a whole less transformed into one. Mao school Che, like Mao, believed that voluntary labor for the common. According to Che, socialist consciousness is built through practice, by creating space for collective work and the spread of the commons in society. When relying solely upon material incentives, the past capitalist values tend to crowd out the future. The material interest as an economic lever is the Trojan horse of socialism, reinforcing the alienation and self-orientation inherited from capitalism. Che stressed that the individual learns to transform work from a disagreeable human necessity into a moral necessity for the common good. Michael Lebowitz meant on check position. But the important thing was balance the two on two legs. Che Wunjing insista. Of dual of the construction of building nature a matter of work alone nor of consciousness alone. Il combines work and consciousness ng production over material goods through devil in developing socialism. You should not rely exclusively upon material incentives, stress the idea of socialism in workplaces, communities, and society as a whole to emphasize a balance between the simultaneous developments of productive forces and the creation of socialist human beings. Che's legacy is the recognition that if the future is to prevail, it is essential to build it now by creating socialist consciousness. In the struggle between the future and the past lie two methods of developing socialism. The first is the updating of the economic model, sometimes by using capitalist instruments to create the necessary productive forces to sustain a socialist society. Other is to use moral incentives and to develop a mode of production which enhances the development of socialist attitudes. Cuba has tried to uphold a balance between the two methods. Being a small country in a hostile world, they have achieved remarkable results because they have created a socialist morale. Cuba has survived attacks and blockades from the US and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not only that, but Cuba has been the prime example of internationalism since 1959. In China, we have seen a zigzag course between the two methods, navigating in a sea of changing contradictions. In the era of Mao, the economy was developed using moral incentives, in the form of voluntary work and political campaigns. In the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, Mao appealed to the masses to develop socialism through radical practices. However, as Che foresaw, no one can call upon the masses to sacrifice themselves all the time. This method must remain the exception and never become the rule. Mao's radical mobilization and campaigns were unsustainable in the long term. During Deng's opening up, mark of socialism was introduced. 41. Leading to the rapid development of the productive forces using elements from capitalism and the encouragement of individual material incentives. However, Dengism also lost sight of socialist values and created inequality, corruption, individualism, and degradation of solidarity. In the history of the Communist Party of China, there has been STRTW and unity between the two different approaches to the development of socialism. Depending on the Chinese and global contradictions at hand, Mao himself changed between the two methods. After nearly 40 years of Dengism, the Communist Party under Xi has to rectify the side effects of opening up to the world market. China is once again sliding to the left, trying to balance the need to develop the productive forces with the development of socialist values in society. Even though Mao underlined that socialism's final victory still lies several generations ahead, and that several revolutions must take place in the superstructure, the fact is that China must remain a part of the world economy, which is still dominated by capitalism. China had to go through its own form of state capitalism to create its large-scale, high-tech industry. A socialist mode of production cannot use outdated, underdeveloped technology, but must use the most advanced technology, because it can produce more goods of sustainable, higher quality, with less labor power. Robot industries are better than assembly line factories. Windmills and solar energy are better than fossil energy-fueled power plants. If China had isolated itself to save Mao's state socialist system, it could not have developed the productive forces at the necessary speed, and it would have run the risk of being overrun, both economically and politically. In order to stay in power, the Communist Party chose to arrange production along a more capitalist pattern. Gradually, capitalist values infected the Chinese population and the Communist Party itself. Are the Chinese leaders to be blamed for this? No, it is not their fault that the proletarian revolution has not yet taken place in the advanced countries. But one can, and one ought to, blame the Communist Party for not describing the situation with the same ruthless honesty as Lenin did about the NEP in his day. The truth is, the encounter with neoliberalism has strengthened capitalist values and norms, and a mobiliza lion of the workers and peasants is needed to change direction. But the truth is that China, through a revolution, fundamentally altered life for one of the most poverty-stricken peoples in this world, and in so doing has enriched our knowledge about developing socialism. The Chinese and Russian revolutions are steps in the development toward world socialism. In the words of Lenin, that only by a series of attempts, each of which, taken by itself, will wife RFMB by the revolutionary cooperation of the proletarians of all the Soviet Union and China, are both attempts of this kind, made possible by history's devious road of development in this century. Without the Soviet Union, there may not have been a revolution in China. Without learning from the negative experiences in the Soviet Union, there would be no cultural revolution. And without learning the positive and negative lessons from Deng, there can be no future revolution. The different revolutions changed the nature of the entire world system. Capitalism today is a product of these changes, like in a game of chess. It has reacted strategically to the moves of its opponent. A central thesis in the Chinese perception of the development of socialism is class struggle continues in the post-revolutionary society. It is a long process that might continue for several revolutions. This was also in contrast to the perception in the Soviet Union, which announced that class struggle was over, and that socialism was implemented in 1936. However, if China is heading towards socialism, why is the Corn Party not at the forefront of the class struggle, on the side of the workers against national and transnational capital? Why does the Communist Party allow companies like Foxconn to exploit Chinese workers in the most ruthless way? Why does the party allow real estate speculation on such a large scale to make housing expensive for people, and so on? To explore such questions, we must 100k at the functioning of the transitional state. 43 Lenin. In additional historical lessons, what the transitional state? 303. The capitalist mode of production accumulates on a global scale. However, its political governance is made through the system of competing nation-states in the world system. As long as the capitalist mode of production is vital, and developing the productive forces, the capitalist states will dominate the world system. As Marx said, no social order is descreol before all tb product. Live forces for which it is been developed, and new superior relations of production replace material THRIR within framework of old society. Hence states, seeking to develop socialism within this capitalist-dominated world system, only establish a transitional mode of production, to develop the preconditions to move towards socialism. To facilitate this, and survive as a stair in the world system, they had to establish a corresponding transitional state, in which the power of state rests in the hands of the proletariat. A ruling class, whether it is the capitalists or the proletariat, needs state power to uphold its mode of production and ease class conflict, so our society does nor disintegrate into conflicting chaos. The stair is the product and manifestation of class contradictions. In the struggle for state power, the Communist Party represents the interests of the proletariat. However, if this includes a struggle against imperialism, communists can enter alliances with political forces representing other classes, such as the petty bourgeoisie and the national bourgeoisie, as we have seen in the Chinese Revolution. When achieving state power, communist parties have usually formed so-called party states, meaning that the respective communist party forms governments and rules state institutions. In the current case of the People's Republic of China, Xi Jinping is General Secretary of the Communist Party and also President of the PRC. The difference is not pro forma but rather reveals two different organizations in terms of who they represent, their working methods, goals, and discourse. The Communist Party represents the proletariat, and its goal is socialism on the national and world level. The party state and its government represent the people, all classes, including the national capitalists and the interests of resident transnational capital. The tasks of the stair institutions are national development, stability, and harmony. The state also takes economic and political relations. Any task is again to care of for enhance national development and the security of the transitional state in the world system. The discourse is not class struggle and world revolution, but mutual benefit and respect. On the one hand, the party state has the political, economic, and institutional instruments to ensure that the contradictions between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie do not spin out of control, risking state power and the development of the productive forces. On the other hand, the Communist Party must lead the proletarian class struggle, in order to ensure development advances in the direction of socialism. To a certain extent, these tasks are reflected in the two organizational layers. Sometimes the distance between the layers is greater and sometimes they move towards each other, sometimes even blending together, depending on the national and global contradictions. The history of governance in China for the transitional states, the survival within a capitalist-dominated WORLN system has historically been a priority. Air strategy has changed between confrontation to more or less peaceful coexistence and adaptation to capitalism. The strategy, practice, and discourse of two layers, party and state institutions, have been shaped by the interaction between the changing principal contradiction in the world system and the internal national contradiction. Hence, the transitional states have taken different forms in their interaction with capitalism in the history of the world system. The Soviet Union fluctuated between confrontation, alliance, attempted peaceful coexistence, and cooperation, leading to dissolution. LHDMC People for Republic of Korea developed a form of defensive isolation after the Korean War. The Cuban stair has also been pressed into a defensive, isolated national position, but at the same time chose an offensive anti-imperialist foreign policy. Many post-revolutionary party states have given in to the economic, political, and military pressure from the additional historical lessons 305 surrounding capitalist world system, sliding back into a capitalist mode of production and a bourgeois here. Let us focus on how national and international class struggle has been handled by the Chinese transitional state. In the long revolutionary process from 1921 to 1949, class analysis and class struggle against feudalism, the national bourgeoisie represented by the Kuomintang, and invernational capitalism, in the form of Western and Japanese imperialism, was the central theory and praxis of the Communist Party. However, when the Communist Party declared the People's Republic of China in 1949 and established the party state, Mao did not only speak as the chairman of a revolutionary party, but also as the leader of a very poor country, torn apart by decades of war, in a world system dominated by capitalism with the US as the new hegemonic power. The Communist Party had to make the difficult transition from breaking to making. Going from revolutionary STRT-1 to building socialism, class conradicryan had ROB handled differently. China needed stability, unity, and economic development to improve the condition for the masses. Hence the policy of new democracy built on four social classes, namely the peasantry, proletariat, petty bourgeoisie, and national bourgeoisie. In foreign policy, China kept a revolutionary profile, more or less forced by the imperialist isolation of the country, for example in the military confrontation with the US in the Korean War. As the Soviet-Chinese Treaty of Friendship signed in 1950 began to work, the Chinese government became less dependent on the national capitalists, leading Mao to launch political campaigns, including the anti-rightist campaign, under the headline of the Continuing Class SRRT* under Socialism. As the split between the Soviet Union and China evolved up through the 60s, Mao mobilized the grassroots to struggle against capitalist rulers within the Communist Party, which led to the Cultural Revolution. With slogans like "It's right, rebel," "Making revolution is no crime," "Bombard the headquarters," Mao, in the name of class **, mobilized against any authority within the peri or stare institutions, who was deemed to be taking the capitalist road. For Mao the Cultural Revolution was a struggle to maintain the proletariat at the helm of State 306 the power, against a sneaking capitalist counter-revolution. It was a much-needed showdown with bureaucracy, expert mental, ITY, and hierarchy generated by the years of Soviet influence. But it did also generate a severe split in the Communist Party, the breakdown of state institutions, dysfunctional economic development, and increased tensions with the surrounding capitalist system. However, was it a class struggle between capital and the proletariat? The capitalists in China in the late 60s were a small minority, and not organized as a class in the party or in state institutions. What was labeled capitalist rulers were a faction in the Communist Party, which wanted to use market forces and ochre capitalist enticements to open up China towards the world market in order to speed up development of the productive forces. During the Cultural Revolution, contradictions that existed within the people and within the Communist Party were handled as if they were antagonistic class contradictions between proletariat and capital. However, in reality there were two different strategies within the Communist Party on how to handle the contradiction between dominating global capitalism and a transitional state, such as China. This is not to say that the difference between the strategies were not that important, but the shift from Mao's mobilization of the people by reference to the socialist moral, the use of material enticements and opening up, also reflect the change in the surrounding world system, from the revolutionary spirit of the long 60s to capital counter-offensive in the form of neoliberal globalization. An indication of the non-antagonistic character between the two lines within the Communist Party is that it was Mao himself who ended the Cultural Revolution and initiated contact with the US. In 1971. After Mao's death in September 1976, Deng Xiaoping replaced Mao's class struggle theory with an economic-oriented pragmatism. The opening towards transnational globalization, initiated in 1978, made transformations in the structure of property relations. Domestic and foreign private-owned relations of production expanded. As existence determines consciousness, it had consequences in terms of the values and norms in Chinese society. It was no longer so the people, self-interest and a competition mentality increased, as well as the pursuit of material interests. The new bourgeois and petty bourgeois classes, the ones who got rich first, together with the ideological and cultural apparatus of the intrusion of man's national capital, generated an ideological trend which was called bourgeois liberalization. The Chinese economist and former member of the Central Committee Lu Qiaoguang, looking back, stated in 2017, bourgeois liberalization occurs not only in the political field, but also in the economic field. Privatization, liberalization, and marketation, opposition to public ownership, government intervention, and opposition to socialism, these are all things that are all related to the economic field. It is not enough to oppose bourgeois liberalization, politically. To prevent bourgeois liberalization in the economic field is to prevent the economic field from deteriorating. If the economic field deteriorates, the political field will also deteriorate. This is a basic common principle of Marxism. As capitalist relations of production increased, bourgeois liberalization gained force. The conception of class struggle that was enforced during the period of Cultural Revolution was criticized. In 1978, the Communist Party broke with the previous position that class struggle during the development of socialism is the main contradiction and promoted socialist modernization as the new line. The official party line maintained that class still continues to exist, but within certain limits. However, a faction of the Communist Party led by General Secretary Zhao Ziyang, who was in charge of implementing Deng's reform program from 1986, was heavily influenced by neoliberal ideas, claiming that the Marxist concept of class struggle is outdated. Accompanying reforms in the economic sphere, reforms in the political sphere calling for liberal democracy emerged in society and inside the Communist Party, in line with what happened in the Soviet Union during the time of Gorbachev. This trend led to the Tiananmen Square uprising of 1989. After Deng Xiaoping realized the danger of the bourgeois liberalization, stating that, "It seems that one Cold War come to an end. But two already begun, one is being waged against all the countries of the South and promote he peaceful of socialist to capitalism." It became clear that the party had to focus more on the ideological front, pointing out that class struggle still exists in China. Jiang Zemin, the new General Secretary, in his speech commemorating the 78th anniversary of the Paris founding in 1991, struggle is no longer the main contradiction in our country, but for a certain period it will continue to exist within a certain limit. Moreover, under certain conditions, it may intensify. It did so in the new factories run by transnational capital in southern China, in the SRRT** over privatization of steel companies, and because of the introduction of market forces and equaling social welfare and security. Hu Jintao, General Secretary, tried to calm things down by upholding the principle of a harmonious society for the development of a socialist China. The central point in this social contract between classes was that the contradiction between the socialist principle of political rule over economy versus the power of the market econ only had to be solved in such a way that the dynamics of the market may serve socialism. On one hand, private property of productive forces had to be recognized and protected. On the other hand, the dark sides of capitalism, the damage to the society caused by the disorderly expansion of capital, had to be tamed, and this was difficult. China is opening up for transnational capital. The outsourcing of industrial production and the accompanying transfer of technology had a positive effect on the development of the productive forces, but as private property increased, it had negative effects on social life. The condition of labor in the national and transnational capitalist companies. Inequality. The worsening of ecological problems, internal labor migration. The housing problems in the major cities, the general level of stress, and the after the crises of neoliberalism in 2006-7. It became clear that the negative effect of neoliberalism had outweighed the positive effects. The Communist Party began to change course, tackling the negative effects of the intrusion of capitalism. As a result of the new posture, several changes occurred: a shift from an export-oriented economy to emphasizing the domestic market, erasing poverty in rural areas, and an insistence that class struggle is still an issue. Xi Jinping coming to power in 2012 Pete Zhang's mini position. In 2014 Xi explains, the political of Marxism is primarily a class position, which implemento class analysis. Some people say that this idea no longer responds to the present era, which is a mistaken point or view. We say that THX class and TRY is not saying that in R and TRY within certain limits no orthal in the international sphere it dryas nar exist either AR. The capitalist class is not a politically well organized force which can challenge the state power of the proletariat, but the expansion of private property and the accompanying mentality, in the form of norms and values in society, the bourgeois challenge. When she talks about ideological SRRTs, it is nor class true in the traditional sense. She warns against money worship, hedonism, ultra-individualism, and historical nih. He states that, the formation of firm ideals and beliefs is neither achieved overnight nor once and for all but must be constantly tempered and tested in concrete STRTW. He says that, it will be no easy task like a walk in the park, it will not happen overnight. Or slow we must allow a mindful of risks. Mzinkane strat *IC focus and determination. And would be a mistake to diminish the role of class struggle in China. Given the expansion of capitalist relations of production in the past decades, is obvious that class contradictions would intensify. The problems facing China today are different from the I-70s, when the main contradiction was between the IOW level of development of the productive forces, and the growing demands of the masses. However, according to Xi, this development was characterized by an unbalanced capitalist growth, deepening inequality, rural/urban divisions, and creating an unsustainable relationship to the environment. The values and norms of neoliberalism have also left their mark. Individualism, a competition mentality, and greed have made their inroads at the expense of solidarity and community. She now redefined the main contradiction as the unbalanced and inadequate development and the growing needs of the people for a better life. To ease contradictions, she emphasizes the policy of common prosperity instead of Deng's some get rich first. Tax laws to redistribute wealth, a huge campaign to eliminate rural poverty, new laws to regulate the working condition, and rules to reduce speculation in the real estate sector were all introduced. However, at the same time, Xi Jinping stressed the need to promote the unity and STRTWLE of the Chinese people and to promote harmonious class relations. The Governance of Spina is also the title of the 4-volume collection of Xi Jinping speeches and writings. Xi, as a member of the Communist Party since his youth, is a schooled Marxist, and knows all about class struggle as the driver for change. He often affirms the party's adherence to Marxism, but seldom discusses the specific class in China and the future of the national capitalist sector, national and transnational. She is also president of the People's Republic of China, which needs class harmony to continue the economic development to fulfill the needs of the people. SIA Front Work Conference. Xi Jinping that we should promote the unity and SRNWLEAF the Chinese people at home and abroad and gather great strength for great rejuvenation of 52. The concept governance became popular in political science in the 1980s, meaning the act or the direction of additional historical lessons 311. This blend of understanding the transformative role of class struggle, and promoting class harmony, is not schizophrenic or revisionist. IR reflects the real dilemma or balancing exercise between the need for the development of the productive forces in a transitionary state within a world still dominated by the capitalist mode of production on the one side, and on the other side, the need of proletarian class struggle to maintain state power and push towards a socialist mode of production. This takes into account the concrete reality that class struggle in China between labor and capital, and the ideological struggle between bourgeois ideas, norms, and values and socialist values is a long-lasting struggle, which will go on as long as capitalist relations of production plays a major role in China. It is important to understand and differentiate between the phases in the transformation process. We have to distinguish between when we talking about the development of the productive forces in a transitionary state in a world system still dominated by the capitalist mode of production, or when WC are talking about the final transformation of the mode of production, from capitalist to socialist. In the first case we can use capitalist management and the market to move towards socialism. In the second case we have to eliminate residual elements of the capitalist mode of production as they no longer play a progressive role in the development of the productive forces, but are blocking and even destroying and development. This is the tipping point, when it is time to move from taking advantage of the capitalist mode of production to eliminating it, and to release the socialist mode of production from the constricting residual bind of capitalism. We are approaching the point where the need for another mode of production becomes more and more pressing as the destruction of global ecology and climate accelerates under capitalism. The transformation towards socialism at the national and global level. The dialectic of the transitional state is represented by, respectively, the nationalist development perspective and the universal socialist perspective. An advanced socialist mode of production must be global, as the 312 the capitalist mode of production is globalized both in terms of geography and in function. But the global transformation has to go through the national state, as the world system is politically organized in national states. The national framework constitutes a historical constraint that must be taken into account as a necessity, not something we should make into a hence. China, or any other transitionary state should not appear to avoid contact with globalist capitalism. As they cannot carry on the transformation process towards socialism in isolation from a capitalist mode of production which is still developing the productive forces and hence a source of useful advanced technology. In addition, the transitional interaction with global capitalism is part of the transition process, as it modifies capitalism and presents itself as an alternative to capitalism. So China can, and has to, continue part of the way to socialism on the national road, as socialism with Chinese characteristics, but also must keep in mind that a developed socialist mode of production has to be realized on the global level, as it has to solve the historically inherited problem of inequality between center and periphery in the world system, as well as the global ecological and climate problems. As we step towards that advanced stage in socialism, we will see the development of different socialisms with national characteristics, based on different histories and cultures. However, it is essential to move on from the nationalist version towards global socialism, as the national component contains material for future national disputes. For the transitional state it is important to keep the right balance between the national interest and socialist transformation in relation to the surrounding world system. The nationalist aspect should not dominate the socialist perspective, as I think happened when China launched the three-world theory around 1974. The confrontation with the Soviet Union, and the opening towards the US in 1971, led China to pursue a nationalist foreign policy. Nationalist disputes between transitional states will not only benefit capitalism, but will also increase the risk of nuclear warfare and slow down solutions to the urgent environmental and climate problems. It will block the transition towards advanced global socialism. The fact that humanity has transitioned from scattered local blocs, then from states and empires, towards a more and more globalized world system, equipped with advanced productive forces, means that we have developed a way of living that has damaged the planet, and acquired weapons with the ability to destroy human life. But it has also contributed the knowledge and ability to organize and manage the world system as a whole, needed for an advanced social mode of production. The transformation of the relations of production towards socialism does not mean going back to productive forces organized within a national framework. World unification has ceased to be an option. It has become a condition of its existence. For us, remaining in capitalist states in the world system, an understanding of the dialectic of the transitional state is important. The understanding of the dilemmas and the balance between the need for national development versus advancing socialism nationally and globally is important and a guide for us, in the global north, on how to relate to the transitional states, in order to defend them against imperialism, but also advance the transition to socialism. We must support the transitional states' respective nationalist aspects, against the hostile capitalist states. Not only to defend their attempt to develop socialism, but also because they are an essential anti-imperialist component, balancing imperialism, providing breathing space for socialist movements in the remaining capitalist world system. However, we must also push for a socialist transformation by class struggle, wherever we can, to ensure that the socialist aspect dominates the national aspect in the contradictions of the transitional state. As we approach this revolutionary endgame, the class struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie at a national and global level will be accentuated. It will be a dangerous game. Mao called imperialism a paper tiger. Imperialism and all reactionaries, looked at in essence, from a long-term point of view, in a strategic point be seen for what they gem on this. Strategic thinking. On this comprehensive overview through the history of the struggle between capitalism and socialism, I begin this chapter by summarizing the history of the capitalist mode of production through the lens of the fundamental contradiction in historical materialism. Lee serves the purpose of explaining why I think capitalism has entered the end phase. The history of the capitalist mode of production. The mode of production to satisfy our material needs or sustain human life is the fundamental condition of all history. Marx identified two interdependent structures, which describe how humans interact with nature in the process of producing their subsistence, the forces of production and the relations of production. Any forces of production are everything that humans use to produce the things that society needs. In order to carry our production and exchange, humans enter into relations of production determined by the development of the existing forces of production, present at any given time in history. The fundamental contradiction in history is between the development of the productive forces and the relations of production. At a certain stage of their development, the forces of production come into conflict with the existing relations of production and the property relations within which they had been at work before. From the forms of the forces of production, these relations turn into their fetters. Then comes a period I Marx. Karl. German Ideology, in Works, Volume S. Publishers, Moscow 1976 p. 49. 316. The of Social Revolution. However, no social order can disappear before the role of its productive forces have been developed. Additionally, new relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society. Point 2. Keeping this in mind, we can formulate the short historical materialist story of capitalism. In the first part of the capitalist mode of production had its breakthrough in Western Europe after centuries of Europe colonialism, which provided the primitive accumulation of capital. In a dialectical way, Marx, on one hand, affirmed the positive, progressive features of capitalism, new technology and development of science, industrialization, urbanization, mass literacy, and so on. On the other hand, he denounces the exploitation, the human alienation, the commodification of the social relations, the false ideology, the imperialism, and its connected mass extermination, all inherent in the modern Intian process. These two perspectives on capitalism represent the difference between analyzing the development of productive forces from within the framework of capitalist relations to the need for their appropriation by the people, the establishment of a new mode of production. This dialectical perspective on historical development permeated Marx and Engels' writings. In the Communist Manifesto, they describe the rise of capitalism as a progressive stage of historical development. In the first pages they describe modern industry, modern bourgeois society, modern workers, modern state power, modern productive forces, and modern relations of production. In the preface to Capital, Marx writes that the purpose of the book is to disclose the egenornic law of motion of modern society. Marx defended modernity because it prepared the way for a more fully developed modernity, socialism. The imperialist aspect of capitalism united and polarized the WORLN system in a center-periphery structure, characterized by the super-exploitation of the labor force in the periphery, and a rising wage, hence its expanded consumption power in the center. Lee's value transfer entailed a dynamic development of the productive forces in the center, and at the same time, blocked development in the periphery. Consequently, there was no need and no successful revolutions in the center. Capitalism had nor played its role. In the periphery, on the other hand, capitalism eroded feudal and other pre-capitalist modes of production, but the development of the productive forces was blocked by super-exploitation and the flow of value towards the center. Only a revolutionary process could get the wheels of the economy running again, by initiating the development of a transitionary mode of production on the road towards socialism. Had to be transitionary mode because the world system was still dominated by capitalism, economic, political, and military. The lack of development of productive forces in the periphery, and the hostile WORLN system, hindered an immediate transition to a socialist modernity. This is the history of the Soviet and Chinese revolutions, and their effort to develop socialism in the 20th century. Lenin and Mao had the same dialectical approach to the development of the productive forces as Marx had. From an historical materialist point of view, the answer to this development is not an attempt to roll back the productive development of the productive forces. As Lenin approvingly quotes Hilferding, reply of the proletariat to the gnomic policy of finance capital and to imperialism cannot be free trade, but socialism is. The answer to this new phase of imperialism cannot be a for maintaining the old forms of more national-based capitalist economics, but the struggle for a more social treatment of the productive forces, a more social version of internationalization. As Lenin said, to insist of WHCCHCR forward further deepening of the antagonisms which it engenders, or backward, Ardzalaying Ibsian Rob are fundamental questions in the critique wanting to fight against the internationalization of production. Trade, and finance means demanding a return to a situation of which the present one has grown. In other words, it is reactionary. According to Lenin, Koskaya critique of monopoly capitalism was the result of a petty bourgeoisie opposition to imperialism, caused by the general actionary tendency at the present time. We are experiencing the same opposition and general reaction to transnational globalization in society. Both are forms of right-wing national conservatism and left-wing populism longing for the paradise lost of small-scale national capitalism. Called the newly emerged trusts of his time progressive omena. In spite of the suffering they caused. He knew that one does not struggle for socialism by striving to stop economic development. Will only lead to the intensification of the contradictions of imperialism which will make the transformation towards socialism inconvertible. The transnational companies and the globalization of production they stand for, are in that sense progressive. They want the creation of new social productive forces. This is not to say that technical progress is independent, or that they take priority over the organization of social relations. Not at all. What we are discussing is the development of productive forces within the capitalist mode of production, and if the current transitional mode of production in what we call socialist countries are some of state capitalism with markets relations, then it must also apply to them. Emmanuel says that we should not, _slik FMM of capitalism to of within capitalism in other words. This forgers that if capitalism is hell there exists a still more frightful hell, is, less developed capitalism this is if not got a historia it nonetheless in history. It is a by its nature, it develops the productive forces. And if this development leads satisfactions of social nonetheless framework for a certain satisfaction of these needs than those of TLW as stated by Marx, no social system is destroyed until all the possibilities for the development of the productive forces which it contains have been exhausted. Neoliberal globalization was such a possibility par excellence. It created the framework for yet another gigantic development of the social productive forces. In a historical materialist perspective, this means the neoliberal globalization has brought the day closer when capitalism will have exhausted all its possibilities and will suffer a profound crisis, this time not only national, but global. As this crisis will affect most countries simultaneously, this will make it easier for the working class to carry through and maintain the revolution. Neoliberal globalization, from the end of the 1970s onwards, was the counter-offensive from capital against the challenges of different kinds of transitional modes of productions in the socialist bloc, nationalists in the third world, and in the form of social democratic welfare states in the center. Neoliberalism globally 7xd the production process itself. It relocated hundreds of millions of industrial jobs from the global north to the low-wage countries of the south in search of higher profits. Neoliberal globalization gave capitalism 40 golden years of high profit and cheap goods for consumers in the global north. It dissolved the so-called actually existing socialism in Soviet and East Europe and penetrated deep into the Chinese economy. However, in our examination and evaluation of neoliberal globalization, transnational companies and transnational production chains, we must adopt a dialectical approach towards the development of the capitalist mode of production, between the progressive role it has and the agony it produces. We must also distinguish between when we are analyzing the development of productive forces within the global capitalist system and when we are discussing the contradictions leading to the transformation of the relations of production. Capitalism is characterized by an enormous development of the productive forces, with an extensive division of labor, accompanied by an increasing concentration of capital in still larger transnational companies. The neoliberal globalization marks a further step along this road. The new technological revolutions in computers and communications, new management systems, the new large-scale transnational operations production, and all that this involves, could not be sufficiently developed under the old conditions. It was the development of the productive forces themselves, which acted independent of the will of the individual capitalist, and demanded to be treated increasingly transnational to be 320. On one hand, the result of neoliberal globalization was an increased transfer of value to the north. On the other hand, the immense development of the productive forces in the global south began to turn the table. China became the crank in the global system of production as an unintended side effect of the capitalist desire to exploit the Chinese proletariat. In its encounter with neoliberalism, China kept the command of its economy and its national project. China managed to break 2 centuries of polarized development in the world system of global capitalism and develop its productive forces to an advanced level. The transformation of the relations of production towards socialism does not mean going back to productive forces organized within a national framework. On the contrary, socialism implies equalization of international ties and global solutions to ecological and climate issues, a globalization of another kind. The development of the productive forces in the second half of the 20th century has globalized production and trade to a new level, but it has also globalized nuclear warfare and environmental destruction to a new level. This has an impact on our consciousness. We are now able to grasp the world as a whole and relate to our planar Earth in a new way. The image of our green and blue planet in the dark universe, as seen from a spaceship, contributed to this. But it is also the knowledge of how our mode of production has damaged the planet, and that our weapons have the ability to destroy human life. This has also contributed to the formation of this consciousness. The fact that humanity has transitioned from small communities to states, then empires, towards a more and more globalized world (TEM), equipped with advanced productive forces, means that we have the knowledge and ability to organize and manage the world system as a whole. The transformation of the relations of production towards socialism does not mean going back to productive forces organized within a national framework. World unification has ceased to be an option. Rather, it has become a condition of its existence. With the crises of global neoliberalism, the decline of U.S. hegemony, the rise of China, and the development of a multipolar world system, It seems that capitalism is reaching the limits of its ability to exploit humans and nature. There is no longer a territorial fix to the problem. The capitalist mode of production is nor only blocking, but destroying, the development of human life on planar Earth. What does truest change imply? The end game is on, and it is possible and necessary to move from the transitionary relation of production to a socialist relation. It is getting rid of exploitative capitalist relations of production and patterns of consumption, which conflict with the global ecosystem. THIRD is the development of investment and trade to promote global equality. It is the development of common prosperity, instead of privatization and extreme individualism. It is solidarity instead of competition. This mode of production requires that the majority in the world system join the effort. So, how does this general and rather abstract contradiction, the development of productive forces against the mode of production, unfold as specific economic and political contradictions on the global and local level? The contradiction of the end game: the Soviet proletariat gained power during World War I before the preconditions for socialism were present. The Chinese proletariat achieved the same. Cuba, Vietnam, and other decolonized countries in the Third World have crafted their own histories outside the narrow Eurocentrism of the Western left. Since the decline of the long 1960s, and throughout the half-century of neoliberalism, revolutionary socialist movements have been unable to forge new political organizations of significant strength. But this is not the end of socialism. 46 years separated the Paris Commune from the October Revolution, with another 32 years between it and the Chinese Revolution. Marx underestimated the longevity of capitalism, as did Lenin and Mao. Many of us in the 1968 generation have predicted the end of capitalism several times, and our hopes for world revolution were frustrated. This has led to the mistaken belief that capitalism can assimilate all critiques and innovate out of all problems. Universalization of the present denies the historical specificity and 322 the transitory character of capitalist social relations. History has shown all modes of production have a beginning and an end. Capitalism is no different, and we might be at the turning point. It is easier to evaluate the past than predict the future of capitalism, but both are necessary to formulate strategies for change. Historical materialism teaches us capitalism has a lifespan. Has successfully reproduced its existence for 200 years, where there are limits to reproduction. It is not a system in balance. Its historical impurities have enabled it to reproduce itself. Trade union struggle gave the European working class higher consumption power. The growth of mass consumption in the center without a drop in the profit rate was financed by exploitation of the periphery. However, this dynamic has been challenged by the rise of China. Like the late Emanuel Wallerstein, I believe that the decline of U.S. hegemony forebodes the end of capitalism. This will not take place within a decade, but it seems clear that the 21st century is the autumn of the capitalist system. Industrialization of the Global South in recent decades signals a significant change in the dynamics of global capitalism itself. The system is losing the balancing force of the center-periphery dichotomy. Certainly, an industrialized Global South is not to be as prosperous as capitalism in northwestern Europe and North America. Neither India, Indonesia, nor Brazil has a periphery to exploit that is substantial enough to feed the development of welfare capitalism. And ecological. The world cannot sustain such a capitalist world system. However, the development of productive forces in the Global South will 3C and the privileged positions of the United States and the European Union and accelerate the crises of global capitalism. In the endgame, global capitalism will be haunted by crises generated by the old contradiction between the need to expand production and the inability to consume the produced goods. Unequal exchange of trade, which has transferred value from south to north, reached its zenith in 2011 and is now declining. As wages are rising in China and global trade patterns are changing. The creation of consumption power by debt pushing the problem into the future is also reaching its limit. profits will decline and accumulation will come to a halt. As Marx predicted, will become more frequent and more violent, if only because, as the Entleitlu, the world market becomes more and more contracted. And in coal markers remain available for exploration, since every preceding crisis has subjected to world trade a market hitherto unconquered or only superficially. The development of the productive forces of China and other countries in the global south signals nor only a shift in dynamics within capitalism, but also enhances the material conditions for the development of socialism. On devious roads for more than 100 years, capitalism is finally approaching a dead end. We may now see the realization of Engels' prophecies in a letter to Koskai in 1894, it again I office storachim still to for capitalist production. And in so at the latter makes its own existence at home impossible. China's revolution fundamentally contributed to the global transition from capitalism to socialism. The principal contradiction: what is the driving force in this transition? Who are the subjective forces in the process? What will trigger the revolutionary situation? Light first step in answering such questions is to identify the principal contradiction. We have to be specific in our analysis. To develop a strategy, which can be used for intervention, we must investigate both aspects, and between them to decide which way the contradiction will move. The principal contraction is not fixed, it changes as the balance of its aspects changes, and interacts with other contradictions. Since the 1970s, the principal contradiction has been between national capital's neoliberal globalization project and the nation-state's attempt to domesticate capitalism and try to dampen the negative effects of outsourcing and privatization to regulate capitalism. Until the turn of the millennium, transnational capital was the dominant aspect of this contradiction. However, the economic consequences of neoliberalism, in both the global North and South, generated nationalist demands for a stronger state, as bulwarks against globalization. In the past decades, globalized capitalism and its institutions came under increasing pressure from both right and left-wing nationalist political forces. The new international division of labor, created by neoliberal outsourcing, changed the power structure in the world system. Northern transnational capital turned China into the factory of the world, but it did not turn China into a permanent periphery of the center. China broke the historical polarizing tendency in the capitalist mode of production. China used the neoliberal intrusion to develop its national PROJ with Chinese characteristics. In May 2020, Newsweek magazine published an article with the telling headline, "America is in a new Cold War and this time the communists might win," which lines up with the situation. Deploy integrated with Donned Worlds. LS the case with the former Union, which was largely isolated economically, whaling only with its East Bloc neighbors. China is sophisticated across a wide of critical tech including artificial ta national its in Chi 2025 in ens nor just in quantum computing and bot in biotech, advanced telecom internet at ions, green energy and a host during the height of neoliberalism, CLS. Hegemony was based on economic and technological superiority. This advantage is now challenged by China. William Barr, Attorney General, expressed this. That is taking shape. In essence, communications networks are not just for LLWY into talk NE of next generation of the internet, the next generation of industrial systems char will depend on GOT infrastructure. China has built up lead in capturing 40% of 5G time in is law in G the technology era _ we see the US increasingly utilizing trade blockades, sanctions and military pressure to uphold its dominant position. The economic competition, which characterizes the neoliberal era, has been replaced by territorial disputes. With the coming RO power of Trump in 2017, the world entered another phase of mercantilism, a sharp increase in trade/sanctions wars and a new arms race. The US/NATO proxy war in Ukraine against Russia is also an attempt to destabilize and encircle China and apply pressure to any state that challenges US hegemony. GER a regime change in Russia and then in China. However, this is tearing apart the neoliberal world market, which is necessary for the continued accumulation of transnational capital. The transition from neoliberal economic-driven imperialism towards old-fashioned territorial imperialism is nor in the interest of transnational capital, which is dependent on global production chains to generate surplus value, and access to the entire world market to realize the profit. If the 2007-8 crisis was the crisis of financial neoliberalism, then the current crisis is the crisis of production. The interests of U.S. transnational capitalism and the state are increasingly at odds. However, transnational capital cannot distance itself from its political leadership, which provides security for its operation. There is no way out of the dilemma for transnational capital, as it is the crises of neoliberalism itself which has created this situation. Any immediate need of political imperialism overrides the interests of transnational capital. U.S. policy is becoming self-destructive. It shatters the world market, upon which America has built its power since the end of the Second World War. The disintegration of Blob al-Intian is a reconfiguration of the power structure in the world system. In retrospect, China was admitted into the global trade regime in 1972 because of the U.S. rivalry with its chief opponent, the Soviet Union. Beating the Soviets first, then China, was the plan. U.S. superiority in technology and finance, at the time, gave it the confidence to open its global trade regime to any country willing to play the game, regardless of ideology. At this phase, the globalization regime was a gigantic profit machine based on global production chains and the extraction of cheap production factors from the global south. Today, as the U.S. is no longer economically competitive, instead it uses its military power and an ideological alliance with Europe and Japan for geopolitical to rule the world system. The former principal contradiction between transnational globalization and nationalist states is being replaced by a new emerging principal contradiction between the forces which want to uphold U.S. hegemony and the forces which seek a multipolar world order, headed by China. Transnational capital in the global north is forced by the changing winds in the world system to join with nationalist and conservative political forces in the north. The LLS, the EU, Japan, New Zealand, and Australia, have united to uphold U.S. hegemony. They constitute one aspect of the principal contradiction. Other aspect is headed by China, the upcoming economic and political world power, and its ambition to build socialism with Chinese characteristics. China is allied with a conglomerate of states which, for various reasons, are opposed to the continuation of U.S. hegemony and want a multipolar world system. They are united in the ambition to change the North-South structure, which has dominated the world SYS-TEM for the last 2 centuries and expand South-South and East-West relations. It seems that the only way to uphold U.S. hegemony and solve the crises of neoliberalism is to reconquer China for a word rhyme, which means subjecting China to the interest of Western transnational capital. The first time was the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century, the second time was the opening of China in the I-90s. Hence, the U.S. political elites have identified China as the main rival in the future. As China turned from a pool of low-wage workers to a competitor on the world market, the Obama administration began its policy of Asia-Pacific rebalance, also known as the pivot to Asia. The Trump administration launched a trade war, technology, and a series of military maneuvers. Joe Biden has followed that track. The U.S. strategic competition with China is full-scale: technology, trade, currency, geopolitics, and ideology. The U.S. is increasingly adopting Cold War rhetoric, describing its engagement with China as a rivalry between two opposite ideologies, and even civilizations. The same rhyme, the U.S. pressures other actors to take its side against China. As a response, China is establishing an alternative trade and finance system, the Belt and Road Initiative and BRICS. If China can delink softly from its dependence on US and EU markets, we will see the emergence of two economic cores, with separate financial and monetary institutions, but to some extent, overlapping supply chains and markets. If the contradiction escalates and takes on an antagonistic character, we could see a hard delinking, raising the probability of military confrontation. For the time being, the US is well aware that direct military intervention in China is not an option. Instead, the US is trying to create a crisis to overthrow the communist party of China and install a pro-Western regime to subject China to Western capital interests, keeping it in a permanent subaltern status. The US has tried to create tensions around Taiwan, Tibet, Hong Kong, and the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It has also covertly supported Uyghur separatists in Turkey and Syria to draw China into conflicts with Islamist groups. For the US to confront China is very different from the confrontation with the Soviet Union in decline. China is not a falling star. In fact, China is too important for the world economy to collapse. The United States and China are economically interdependent, with trade between the two nations reaching $500 billion in 2020, and China holds hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. bonds. Thus, the U.S. seeks to change China's political system while keeping the economy running. This is a dangerous game. It is a conflict on how to organize the world system and the future. It can generate wars and will hamper efforts to solve ecological and economic problems as international cooperation and diplomacy become stalled by Cold and War wars. In the long 1960s, we hoped the Third World liberation movements would build socialist states to cut off the pipelines of value transfer to the center. We were too optimistic. Neoliberal globalization still offered an escape route. It seems today that from the north, in its desperate struggle to uphold hegemony, is disrupting the imperialist pipeline system. From the south, China has succeeded in diminishing the imperial rent of unequal exchange, while simultaneously breaking the technological monopoly of Western capital. Chinese economists have calculated that, between 1978 and 2018, on average, 1 hour of work in the United States was far free of Chinese work. However, from the middle of the observed a very inexwitled in 2018.6_4 of labor were still exchanged for I of US_ since 2011, the global value transfer of unequal exchange from south to north has begun to decline, partly due to rising wages in China, partly due to declining north-south trade as the neoliberal world marker erodes. The US is still the dominant aspect. However, the erosion of the neoliberal world market, and alternative political and financial institutions without the dollar as the world trade currency, may shift the balance of the contradiction. As time passes, the US will become poorer, and the economic crises in the remaining neoliberal sector will generate disagreements between the US and its allies. Whether US hegemony is in terminal decline, or its military offensive will allow it to preserve its hegemony for the next several decades, the contradiction between US and China will affect all other contradictions. No aspect of the global economy, political movement, or state will be untouched by Ri's contradiction. The US confrontation with China will be different from the Cold War with the Soviet Union in the 1950s. Chin's economy is resilient and more self-sufficient. It can replace exports by expanding its internal market using planning techniques. China, GDP will be overtaking in the next decade. China is investing heavily in domestic infrastructure and the development of new technology. It has the Belt and Road initiatives. It is China which has plans and visions for the future, while the US is a destabilizing factor, creating chaos in the world system. Let us look at the main actors in the new regionalization, and how their internal contradiction interacts with the principal contradiction. The US envisages a permanent unipolar world, governed by its huge military force. Since 1945, the United States has engaged in 211 interventions in 67 countries. It currently maintains 250,000 soldiers stationed in 700 bases distributed throughout 150 nations, an unprecedented imperium. Direct invasions have been replaced by proxy wars, economic sieges, and destabilization of targeted countries. These hybrid wars also include more pervasive media campaigns than the old anti-communist propaganda. The US uses a network of foundations and NGOs on social media. The official U.S. defense budget in 2022 was $765.8 billion, 4 times that of China, 12 times that of Russia, and 30 of Iran. NATO expanded and rearmed its forces in Europe in their confrontation with Russia. However, NATO has also expanded its area of operations globally, mobilizing its allies to form an anti-China geopolitical alliance. The 2022 strategic concept of NATO stated, "The Republic of China Security and PRC seeks to control key technological and industrial sectors, critical infrastructure, and strategic materials and supply chains. We will together responsibly, as allies, to address the systemic CLLNC% by the PRC to enduring ability to guarantee defense and SCCURIC of allies. WC will our shared awareness, enhance resilience preparedness, and protect against the co-tactics and efforts to divide the alliance." The UK, the LLS and Australia formed the AUKUS Pact in 2021 to encircle China. From Australia through the Pacific, to Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea, and across Eurasia, to Afghanistan and India, the US bases form the PEFEC News. This military superiority is not without cost. America's military spending and wars have left its treasury indebted to foreign governments and their central banks. It is nor only in its confrontation with China that U.S. dominance is challenged, but also eroded from the inside by the split in the political elite, which cuts through society. It is not just an ordinary political dispute between the Democratic and Republican parties. The Democrats are trying to get the former President from Ison changed with treason and staging a coup. Like 2024 presidential election may develop into a major crisis, whether a Democrat or Republican wins, if the electorate refuses to acknowledge the result as legitimate. Europe, the European Union, after the shocks of Brexit and the growth of populist nationalism in almost all member states, is through #G to regain its footing. Lacking a strong united administration, and without its own armed force, the EU cannot deal with the overspill of conflicts in proximal regions, nor to speak of the global level. The EU is left on the front line of American confrontations. In the past 15 years, European countries have integrated with the Russian energy market and expanded their trade with China. The piped natural gas through Nord Stream 2 was cheaper and less dangerous than liquefied natural gas from the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Mexico. Several European countries also joined the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. All this is to the frustration of the CLS, which has tried to prevent or delay that process. The financial crisis of 2007-08 was a sign to the rest of the world that the U.S. economy was untrustworthy. The Trump presidency did nor help American credibility in European eyes. In 2018, Trump criticized NATO General Secretary, the Norwegian Jens Stoltenberg. We protecting Germany. Protecting France. We're protecting, and then of go CWT make a pipeline deal with Russia. Where they're paying billions of into the coffers of Russia, Germany is a captive of Russia. I think it's very inappropriate. The war in Ukraine and the EU's boycott of Russian gas and oil have created inflation and made EU products less competitive in global markets. EU's foreign policy chief Josep Borrell acknowledged this in October 2022, our CLWOP EOG and supposedly affordable, stable. It been proved not the case. And China far exports and imports, for technological transfers, for investments, for having cheap goods. I think that tlu CHM mayor to conquer inflation then all the central bank stairs take care of RRIRY_Russia provided the basis prosperity. Is a world that is no there, is tlu list GM ibis portent force _second characteristic is a competitive world where is being the proxy war against Russia on Ukraine's soil was an opportunity for the US to discipline Europe and strengthen the NATO alliance under its command, an alliance that now also includes Finland and Sweden. In another case of the second rhyme as farce, we are seeing a reenactment of the summer of 1914, when the European labor movements nearly all rallied to their national warmongers. However, it is not just about Ukraine and Russia, but about preventing the integration with China. This development has been costly for the EU. Not only are they forced to increase their military budgets by hundreds of billions, but their economy is also hurt. The US policy is dragging Europe down a price Europeans seem to be willing to pay to protect their imperial mode of living for the time being. However, NATO membership is not a la carte. Europe must swallow the US global menu, including its Middle East and China policy, and what if military expenditures occur at the expense of healthcare and social services? War if the US political system becomes unstable? What if the US threatens to drag Europe into a direct war with Russia or China? Will the NATO alliance continue to be stable? Asia and Oceania. A similar dilemma is unfolding in Asia. LHI cooperation between China, Japan, Korea, and Association of Southeast Asian Nations and countries appears to be beneficial for all countries in the region. However, Japan and South Korea, firmly under US dominance, have to struggle with the dilemma of whether to befriend China, with which they have close economic ties, or yield to US pressure and downsizx relations. The AN countries, likewise, have a close economic connection with China. However, they have been drawn into conflict by disputes in the South China Sea. Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea attended the NATO summit in 2022 for the first rhyme. Australia and Japan, along with India and the are part of called the Asian NATO. -19. As long as medical production is for profit, the distribution of medicines will be unequal. The same goes for health systems, which have been increasingly privatized during the past 40 years of neoliberalism. All this makes it difficult to combat pandemics. COVID-19 has ceased to be a major problem, but what about the next pandemic? It will surely come if we continue with our current farming methods. The planetary character of ecology and the climate question also makes it dependent upon geopolitical developments. There is the danger of nuclear war in a world system with territorial rivalry. Many states have, and more states are acquiring, nuclear weapons, along with the means to launch them. This mathematically increases the risks of mass destruction. Wars between the world's leading powers could very well become the principal contradiction if they escalate into the use of nuclear weapons. While nuclear weapons are essentially defensive weapons, the decision to use nuclear weapons is in the hands of individual, sometimes irrational, human beings. The struggle for peace, when the ruling class calls for war, is of critical importance, and offers a revolutionary perspective as the survival of humanity takes precedence over the system. Things may develop faster than we expect. Global capitalism can either collapse in brutal chaos, or we can manage to achieve an orderly transformation towards a fairer and more sustainable mode of life. That depends entirely on us. The next decades will be dramatic, and a revolution is not a tea party. We will see sudden changes in political alliances. And in this scenario, we need to stay the course and stick to a clear socialist perspective. At the same time, we are running out of time due to climate change. Any majority of the world's population will have to change their production and consumption habits by 2050. Once this dare has passed, the only option will be a transition to a kind of lifeboat socialism, where we must struggle to get through one natural disaster after the other instead of developing a world more prosperous for all. Conclusion: towards a strategy for the transition to socialism. I'm not a utopian socialist. I cherish the socialist ideals, but I do nor 1. Insist on immediate perfection. Nevertheless, we must progress towards realizing them. As I began working practically with third world liberation movements in the I-60s, I experienced the difference between ideals and the pragmatic compromises necessary for the everyday struggle. Practice leads to knowledge. Take, for instance, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which we supported in the 1970s and 1980s. During this period, they gradually moved from a small radical movement with a high revolutionary spirit to a more mature organization with greater responsibility for the protection of Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and Syria. This forced them to compromise with non-socialist regimes like Lebanon and Syria. During the law 1970s onwards, the PFLP developed close relations with the Soviet Union, which we considered a dubious ally. However, the Soviet Union was the only power which counterbalanced the U.S., the main ally of the Zionist occupation. Furthermore, the Soviet Union educated many PFLP members and offered practical, material support. As we learned more about the dilemmas in the daily work of a revolutionary organization, WC became less rigid in our evaluation of this cooperation. You may get dirty hands when you get work done. The utopian socialists in the beginning of the century used all their energy to paint an image of ideal socialisms, while the path towards realizing it remained hidden. Marx instead studied the real existing forces of capitalism to discover a path forward, to unite the wishes for a better towards a strategy for the onto socialism 341 world with a knowledge-based realistic strategy based on existing Kindelions and social movements as a concrete dream. The strategies of transformation have to be realistic, but cannot be confused with reformism. They have to be based on the existing conditions. We must think of the struggle for socialism as practical politics in specific historical contexts. Political movements, institutions, and forms of praxis will reflect their unique conditions in the capitalist world. The strategies and organizations used in the past 2 centuries are not necessarily effective today and in the future struggles. We must learn from history that there are no universal forms of SRRT* or organizational representations of socialist principles. The Paris Commune, the worker councils in the German Revolution, the Soviet model of actually existing socialism, and the Cultural Revolution in China were all historical conditioned attempts at socialism. To attribute these historically specific forms of praxis to some kind of universality, to gain support for immediate strategies, is dangerous. The rejection of bureaucracy does nor mean char planning is no longer part of socialism. On the contrary, planning economic decision, making politics dominating economics is essential for any form of socialism. We need a democratically constituted planned economy which can reconcile human needs with the reproduction of nature. In the global transformational process from capitalism to socialism, such a model has to take place within a state structure. Ideas of direct democracy, taken from anarchism and workers' councils, should be used within the state structure, as these ideas have failed to develop structures that have the necessary transformative power within world state systems. A rigid, idealist, and utopian perception of national and international struggles obscures the complexity and changeability of current class behaviors and interests. An anti-imperialist strategy must contain real existing counter-hegemonic forces capable of challenging the dominant power structure. It is not enough to wish for some socialist workers' movement to take state power from below if you cannot point to its real existence. Western Marxists have for long been trapped in a perception of the world where the idea of socialism is superior to the transitional regimes and modes of production, which have emerged in the past 100 years. In this way, Western Marxists have no real path towards socialism, only criticisms of the movements and stairs to build socialism, and in that way they are siding with capitalism. On the left there exists an idealist perception that working and oppressed classes in pure emancipatory struggles, must be the ones accomplish the transition to socialism. The perception of the masses flushing out the old regimes by pouring in the streets in mass protests organized from below, and general strikes are perceived as the only real revolution. As soon as they get more organized, assume state power, and exercise that power, they somehow become sullied. In this perception, revolutions turn into just one more oppressive regime, as in the case of the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, or Venezuela. However, in the transition process from capitalism to socialism, there is a close relation between the movements of the and oppressed classes and the power of states in the world system. Take again the example of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. In its STRT-1 it had to take into account its relation to the Syrian and Lebanese states, which hosted them, as well as the geopolitical struggle between the US, Soviet Union, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and China. If you insist on purity and ideals in relation to the state powers involved, you will not get far. A pure movement of workers and oppressed people does not exist as a transformative power. It appears in the complex interplay between economic and political contradictions in the world system. Why is China so important? Why do I put so much trust in China's role in the transformation from capitalism to socialism? For one, political power is concentrated in the Communist Party. The Communist Party of China is one of the largest political management machines in human history, with more than 96.7 million members. Its organizational structure reaches every corner of the world's most populous country of more than 4 billion people. The survival and achievements of the party throughout 100 years indicates that it is in touch with the popular base. Base, Emmanuel. Western Marxism, anti-communism, and imperialism towards a strategy for the transition to socialism. 343. When defining the character of China, it is also important to keep in mind that despite the influx of capitalism under Denism, over 70% of workers are still self-employed or employed in non-capitalist enterprises and non-market-oriented public organizations. 2. Public ownership and control of finance. Along with the hands-on approach to market regulations, ultimately left the economy in the hands of the state. 3. The Communist Party has over 7 decades of demonstrable evidence that it can take and enact decisions on how to develop the world's largest nation. Its actions are not dependent on the will of millions of independent capitalists, whose actions are guided by profit motives. China can carry out political decisions, in accordance with plans and a vision, which can change the world. This is why China is important. The national state is the political and economic framework of the world system. This has been the model for the past several centuries and will persist in the endgame. Thus, the transition towards socialism will partly be determined by the between nation states. The nation state remains necessary, as it provides essential security from the surrounding hostile world. During the transitional process, the socialist states will be on the defensive as long as capitalism dominates the world market and the politics of the world system. But the nature of the nation-state and its ability to engage in the transition towards socialism will be determined by the class struggle. The strength of the state is dependent on a pro-people policy to secure the backing of people. In addition to this, it is of vital importance that the socialist-orientated states cooperate to achieve a critical mass of economic and political power to defy capitalism on the global level. I am aware of criticism of both the former Soviet Union and China for statism. The development of an authoritarian state limits the freedom of any form of opposition. The state machinery has certainly not been withering away in states which have attempted to build socialism during the past 100 years. On the contrary, they have built strong states. Remember the difference between Lenin's writings on the nature of the socialist state in State and Revolution in August 1917, and the real theories that led the Bolsheviks to build a strong state just a few months later. Discrepancy is not due to treason against the ideals of socialism. But the Lenin of August 1917 seemed to forget that the mission of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not limited to upholding internal national security. There is also the question of the capitalist world's Western, which became evident with the intervention of the Allied imperialist forces during the Civil War in January 1918. Only strong states can offer the necessary protection against the hostile capitalist world while moving towards socialism. Only when the global transition from capitalism to socialism has reached the turning point, in which the socialist states are in the dominant position, can the process of the withering away of the state take place. The attempt to build socialism inside capitalist societies on the micro level, without state budding, has a long history, first associated with the traditions of cooperatives and anarchism, and later with the New Left collectives in the 1960s, autonomous movements and squatters' collectives in the 1980s, and today with ecological attempts to build sustainable collectives. Marx recognized cooperatives as a vital part of the labor movement, empowering the workers as part of the wider struggle against capital. There is an unceasing dialectic between the tasks of transforming oneself, one's immediate surroundings, and restructuring the larger society. Lee's question is also related to the relationship between creating a socialist human being and transforming society, discussed above. We are at once individual separate human beings and units of a collectivity on different levels. These levels are linked together in the individual, nation, regional, and global levels. How do I relate to nature and other people, from my neighbor to the ones who produce my coffee and smartphone? What do I eat? How do I transport myself? All these considerations have a global impact. These observations draw us back to a familiar argument: how can I change the world if I cannot change my own way of living? Let us start with ourselves. It also expresses a certain impatience with the abstract socialist agenda in general, and that we focus on transforming our immediate surroundings here and now rather than aiming at state power and global transformation. However, I do not see a social praxis inside capitalist society or any other non-state movement with the sufficient power to break the capitalist system without aiming at state power. This is why China is important. Due to the level of its productive forces, China has the potential to be a game changer, which can tip the balance of the world system in favor of socialism. A multipolar world system, representing 90% of humanity, offers a better chance for global equality and a way out of the climate crisis, than the most privileged America and Western Europe. A multipolar world might also be a world with the best chance for social transformation. China has become the principal force in the effort to establish a multipolar world system and a new international economic order, nor dominated by the Bretton Woods financial institution and the dollar as the world currency. This is the reason why the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics becomes crucial, not only for China but also for other nations breaking with capitalism. This is what Samir Emin calls the strategy of disconnection in a polycentric world system. Countries in the global south that want to de-link from global capitalism and develop socialism, or are under sanctions from the US, stand in a better position today than during the Cold War. In the 70s, the Third World demanded a new world order, which came to nothing. Today the global south is creating a new world order. Instead of centuries of exploitative North-South relations, we see the emergence of mutually beneficial South-South investment, trade, and political relations. Today it is within the capacity of the global South to delink and cut the pipelines of imperialism if they have the commitment. China can push for a multipolar world order from a position of strength. It can give material and diplomatic support to countries in the global south that are facing the U.S. much like the Soviet Union once did, but with even greater resources at its disposal. The monopoly of global financial institutions, technology, and science held by the West is broken. Amin, S. World. Z. Books. Anti-imperialism past and present. Anti-imperialism today is not, and cannot, be the same as in the long 1960s. History does not repeat itself, it moves ahead. High revolutionary spirit, and the success of the anti-colonial from the late 1940s until mid-1970s, were due to a combination of contradictions in the world system. The rhyme. This contradiction was between the socialist bloc and the U.S. as well as the contradiction between the emergence of the third world on one side, and the U.S. trying to implement colonialism on the other. There was an intense wish in the Third World to get out of the grip of the West, reflected in the Bandung Conference in 1955 and the formation of the non-alignment movement. This set of interlinked global contradictions opened up the wave of anti-imperialist liberation struggles with a socialist perspective across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. All this changed with the counter-offensive of imperialism, beginning in the mid-1970s, which revitalized capitalism for decades. However, neoliberal globalization was nor the end of a story. The changes in the international division of labor produced the decline of U.S. hegemony and the rise of China, together with the other BRICS members in the world economy, and promoted a multipolar world system. The cooperation between Brazil, India, Russia, and South Africa was founded in 2009, as a result of the financial crises in 2006-07, which revealed the weakness of Western financial institutions. In September 2023, it was enlarged to include Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. BRICS now comprises 46% of the WORLD's population and 32% of the world economy. Its future prospects of growth outweigh those of the G7. The BRICS countries pursue individual strategies to enhance their economic and political regional and world position as U.S. hegemony declines. In that effort, they are at odds with the current rules of the global economy, established to ensure the flow of value to the centers of imperialism. At the same time, they are in need of capital to develop their productive forces. However, to get access to financial resources, they find the IMF and World Bank require that they open their economies to the interests of the West. The trade of the global South is carried in dollars, investments are in dollars, reserves are held in dollars, their debt is to be in dollars, the BRICS are subject to dollar hegemony. Instead of this, they want to work together and take advantage of complementarities in each other's production and markets, to trade and invest amongst themselves for mutual benefit, in order to break the unequal north-south structure of finance and trade. They cannot pursue chat strategy on their own, but acting together, they can begin to challenge the rules-based international order of the imperialist system. BRICS is not an anti-capitalist or socialist organization, it is an organization trying to create an alternative and fairer system of finance and trade. Following the BRICS Plus Summit in September 2023, 30 heads of state and representatives from the G77 plus China group met in Cuba and stressed the urgent need for a comprehensive reform of the international financial architecture. 6. Once again, this does not mean that BRICS is anti-capitalist. And members like Russia are for sure repressive regimes. India is participating in the military Alliance Quad, together with U.S. Japan, India, and Australia directed against China. Iran kills communists and are brutally suppressing women. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are exploiting southern migration labor in the most extreme way. How can this project be progressive? The emerging multipolar world system consists of a complex of contradictory currents between hegemonic and counter-hegemonic, capitalist and socialist forces. The challenge is to navigate these interconnected struggles in the world system. This is what China tries to do. Encouraging anti-hegemonic movements among states of the global South, with the BRICS as a significant support. The lesson from the Chinese revolutionary process was that a rigid view of class relations obscure the complexity and changeability of class behaviors and interests, and the conditions for revolution need to be understood in assessing the overall situation and identifying the principal contradiction. In the 6 Havana in Brazil, the International Peasants' Alliance La Via Campesina, the Farmers' Revolt in India, and China's rural reconstruction movement. The ecological aspect is also the focus of indigenous peoples' struggles throughout the Americas. These movements are finding ways to unite with workers through hashtag and call for a new international of workers and people. Indigenous resistance is an important inspiration in the environmental proletarian revolt, as they take a global perspective. As Nick Estes writes, there is a capaciousness indigenous kinship that goes beyond the human. Whereas past revolutionary struggles have strived for the of capital. We just to imagine. To of the earth from capital. Far the karth to live. Capitalism must die. In the absence of a communist international, we need at least a transnational anti-systemic movements. How do we organize such a movement? It can be done here and now, starting with creating a network through which participants could share resources, experiences, and information, coordinate protests, strikes, and actions, mobilize solidarity. 352 Conclusion and support. In short, organizationally erase the boundaries between isolated struggles and connect them into one common struggle. The specific areas of the transnational struggle can be multiple: the transnational trade union struggle, transnational climate and ecological movements against imperialist wars, anti-racist, anti-fascist, and anti-colonial struggles, the global movement for basic living conditions, etc. From the times of the Communist Manifesto onward, it was understood that the only way to implement socialism was a world revolution. Lauesen believed that the Russian Revolution could only survive if revolutions in the most advanced capitalist countries would follow. Likewise, China hoped that the revolutionary spirit in the long 1960s would draw the Chinese socialist project out of its isolation. However, nationalism had a stronger appeal in Europe, where social democratic parties identified the interests of the working class with the interests of the nation. Eventually, nationalist sentiments grew strong in the Soviet Union as well. Nationalism was also a key factor in Third World liberation struggles. In fighting for their political independence, oppressed nations pitted a progressive nationalism against the reactionary nationalism of the imperialist nations. The failed attempt to develop the national liberation THIRD-WORLDISM into an economic liberation from imperialism by establishing socialist states in the Third World during the long I-60s. Together with the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the Chinese opening to neoliberalism, proved Marx and Engels' statement in the manifesto right. Even if some kind of socialist transition would occur in one country within a dominating capitalist world system, it would still be part of the global division of labor, transnational production chains, and it would have to compete in the global market. This can only lead to the implementation of exploitative practices that benefit the capitalist world economy, as we have seen in China. This requires us to return to global ambition, the only realistic one. The principal contradiction in the world system determines to a large extent the outcome of national and local *s. While we cannot ignore the political reality of nation-states, our strategy must be a global one. The national struggle should contribute to moving the principal contradiction of the world systems in the right direction. Socialism can only flourish when it becomes the dominant mode of production globally. To achieve this situation, the struggle for socialism has to develop from movements, parties, and other kinds of organizations to govern states. Any socialist state can begin to develop a mode of production on the national level, but just as importantly, they can support the struggle for socialism within the entire WORLN system. The existence of actually existing socialism, with all its flaws, secured a balance of power with U.S. imperialism, which made other struggles for socialism possible. The existence of the Soviet Union contributed to the victory of China, Vietnam, and the survival of the Cuban Revolution. Today, a socialist-orientated China can be of great importance for a possible transition towards global socialism. China should not be isolated and forced to retreat into nationalism, but take part in the international struggle for the global transition to socialism. Besides internationalism, the struggle has to have a radical, anti-capitalist perspective. There is no social democratic road to socialism. Social democracy is a mutation of socialism generated by imperialism and can only prosper in the global north as a capitalist welfare state. If reforms in the global north are not accompanied by the deconstruction of imperialism, then they are nor a step forward, they are parasitic. Time is running out for reforms. The capitalist mode of production threatens the balance of global ecosystem. We do not have all the time in the world. Climate change and the transition towards socialism capitalism, especially the past 50 years of neoliberal globalization, has created serious environmental problems. This has already affected the living conditions of millions of people in the global south and led to the formation of movements for a radical change. The global north is trying to reduce global warming without significantly changing the lifestyle that is causing global warming. As usual, capitalism assimilates critique and is now developing green capitalism, which innovates new products and grows in parallel with continuing fossil capitalism. Green capitalism is a contradiction in terms. The competition between capital and stares within the world system forces each capitalist and stare to expand capital accumulation. The current conflict level in the world system reinforced this competition, and the prospect of reaching international agreements which could diminish global warming seem to have vanished. Alternatively, there should be an economic system based on the social ownership of the means of production, which makes political decisions that control how and what to produce. Instead of using surplus products for extended capital accumulation, they can be used for decarbonization, environmental cleaning, or projects to reduce inequality. The climate movement sometimes rends to view the environment and climate as issues separate from class relations, yet climate change is connected to capitalism and imperialism, and therefore is class-related. Citizens in the global north are able to mindlessly consume the globe's resources and throw out the trash only because the rest of the world cannot. The climate STR must be linked to the development of an equal world. It is not possible to raise the living standards of billions of poor people in the global south to the level of the US or Germany within the capitalist mode of production, due to the simple lack of natural resources. To accommodate their needs, it is not only a change in the relations of production and patterns of consumption which is needed to develop socialism on a global scale, it is also a continued development of the productive forces. On this Emmanuel writes, steel, aluminum, and copper, of which the masses of the center consume today in such extravagant quantities, do not serve only to produce automobiles and gadgets. Produce doctors or books as well. A global and sustainable socialism cannot be developed by underdeveloping technology. It needs the most advanced forms of technology. The ruling class cannot and will not save the environment. Instead of pleading with rulers, we need to anchor our understanding of the climate crisis in class analysis. Without the mobilization of the proletariat and peasants, there is no abolition of capitalism, and thus no social ecological transformation of society. The global scale of the climate crisis must be countered by centralist and global planning, which presupposes a global transformation towards socialism. The global movement for socialism must include environmental struggles, while environmental movements must equally take on a class and global perspective. John Bellamy Foster writes, of a VROPLHM ontia into estimgla for a world of equality and constituting the fundamental meaning of socialism and the future of history in our time. Yet, the revolt or humanity in the 21st century will irresistible irrevel elms against all only if it the form of a more revolutionary human subject, emanating from the retalt of the earth, an environmental proletariat. It is time to exit the SC. I may only add the need to construct a new house. Instead of appeals to the capitalist state to act sensible in terms of climate change, the struggle has to go through the establishment of pro-socialist states. And in terms of transition, we are running out of time due to our climate prob the endgame. The endgame will be characterized by intense and sometimes chaotic fluctuations. Today, capitalism is in crisis, an economic crisis aggravated by the erosion and split up of world market and wars. The crisis is ecological. Scientific studies tell us that we are heading toward catastrophe in the form of natural disasters, storms, floods, droughts, and shrinking harvests. A development that is increasing migration and exacerbating the economic crisis. There is political crisis because the bourgeoisie is divided between those who wish to resume neoliberal globalization, change everything to keep everything the same, and paleoconservative factions who want to return to a nation-based accumulation of capital, authoritarian rule, and warfare ro secure the lion share of the global spoils. The split in the bourgeoisie continues down through the middle class and the working class in the global north, between groups linked to transnational capital and groups linked to national sectors. New national conservative alliances arise. The Trump-dominated Republican party in the United States, together with right populism throughout Europe, are all signs of this split and the confusion it causes. The old politicians in the global north are desperately seeking to overcome the gap between the need for transnational capital for continued neoliberal globalization and a growing desire of the electorate to return to the capitalist nation-based welfare state. It is a difficult task. Production and consumption have become globalized. You cannot just dismantle the transnational production chain without a serious loss of profit for capital. Based on the evaluation of the past and present, the following is a possible scenario in the following decades. U.S. hegemony is in decline. The U.S. has lost its economic superiority, its political elite is divided and there is no revival of the American century. China is on the rise. It will continue its development of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Turn ally, it will pursue the establishment of a multipolar world system. Professor Chen Yan from the School of International Relations and Public Affairs in Shanghai has reintroduced the strategy of the encirclement of the cities from the countryside as part foreign policy. 100 years W. The leaders of the Communist Party or China-proof city in the at this time of unprecedented changes, China and the countries need ro break the rare periphery order of the contemporary world and the Western prevention and or countries, as well to solid mighty in global. RU-RAL The Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2013. By February 2022, 146 countries have signed up to join the initiative. In combination with BRICS, China will create South-South and East-West relations to change the old North-South structure of the world system. There is a wish in many countries in the global South to change the U.S. dollar-centered international financial system for several reasons. Due to its hegemonic position, the U.S. had the exorbitant privilege of printing dollars to be used as world money for exchange dollars which never returned to the U.S. for claiming goods. The U.S. also uses the status of the dollar as world money and international financial architecture to sanction countries, as trading denominated in dollars has to transit through a U.S. bank and the SWIFT system. A change to this will further weaken U.S. hegemony, which depends on these structures. A multipolar world system, alternative economic institutions, and the existence of a major technologically developed provide space for social movements and states in the global south to move in the direction of socialism. We may see the development of a different kind of socialism, incorporating the historical and cultural background of each nation. These movements and states will intensify their cooperation, tipping the balance in the world system from capitalism towards the direction of socialism. Socialist advances will originate in the global south, where the popular forces understand that it is not possible to turn the development of the productive forces into a system that benefits the people without a transformation from capitalist to socialist relations of production. These struggles are necessarily arising in specific contexts, embodying environmental, as well as economic and cultural realities. Will develop not just socialism with Chinese characteristics, but socialism with South African characteristics, Brazilian characteristics, and Palestinian characteristics. LES is not just a tribute to diversity, diversity is necessary for success in developing socialism in different contexts. As global capitalism begins to collapse, the immediate concern for future socialist governments in the global south will be how to organize the economy to mere people's basic needs without worsening the ecological crisis. In this transitional period, future socialist-orientated governments may again take up the strategy of delinking from the remains of the capitalist world market and its law of value. Any strategy of delinking would help socialist governments to establish a state monopoly over domestic markets and reduce the pressure from the capitalist world inarcher. The establishment of an international alternative to the capitalist financial system and its dollar tyranny will also improve the maneuvering space for socialist governments to socialize the economy and implement socially and environmentally progressive policies. They will face the task of cleaning up the global environment and developing new ways to produce and consume, which will lead to long-term sustainability. We are at the threshold of decisive transition from capitalism to another mode of production can take two qualitatively different forms. The first is an uncontrolled implosion of capitalism into ecological and political chaos. The second is a transition in which the strategy of the #G classes captures the reality of the situation and solves the contradiction to unblock development of the productive forces. In this case, WC have a transition with a clear vision. However, socialism is not predetermined to follow after capitalism, as the no mechanical rendition of dialectical materialism FTS. It is nor a given fact there is a happy ending. The crisis of capitalism makes objective conditions for change excellent. In a structural crisis, where the system is unstable, the agent plays a decisive role. Light problem is the development of the subjective forces for change. We were too optimistic in the 1970s. However, I believe we are too defensive and pessimistic today. In the introduction, I pointed out that without anger and a burning desire to change the world, it is not possible to mobilize the forces that will create radical change. This anger exists, as spontaneous uprisings across the globe signify. The problem is the strategy that can turn these feelings from the streets into socialist transformation. The pessimism in the mainstream left is understandable given previous failures. But pessimism gets in the way of revolutionary hope. Capitalism survives every crisis, attempts to establish Socialism have ended in disaster, and so forth. Any result is a cynical, toothless critique of capitalism without a perspective of radical change. Therefore, I choose to be an optimist. This choice is part of the ideological struggle both within the left and against the capitalist system. When I say optimism, I do not mean naivete. It is nor simply a matter of time until the masses get it right. What I mean is realistic optimism, taking into account the structural crises and instability of global capitalism, as well as the hundreds of millions of new proletarians in the global south who have nothing to lose but their chains, and are becoming ever more conscious of their power. The development of the productive forces in the global south places the working class in a central position and creates a much stronger foundation for the development of a socialist society than was the case in the decolonization era. Even if the brand of socialism is damaged by the many failed attempts and the mixed experiences of actually existing socialism, I think socialism has a chance to replace capitalism, simply because it has a core of rationality which is needed to solve the problems confronting human. What is to be done? Support a multipolar world system against U.S. hegemony to promote a more peaceful and democratic world, with an empowered and reformed United Nations. Support the global South Israel for a more equal world against the West, which have ruled the world through colonialism and imperialism for the last 500 years. Support the countries and movements developing socialism to end the exploitation of humans and the destruction of planet Earth. What specifically can the left in the global north do? After all, we will not be the driving force in the transition toward global socialism. However, it is nor enough to wail for the proletariat of the global south to create a revolutionary situation in our part of the world. We must be more than passive bystanders. We must make sure that the north is no hinterland for imperialism, which means struggle against right-wing national chauvinism, racism, and imperialist political and military intervention. Anti-war campaigns will be an essential part of anti-imperialism in the coming years. We will be considered national traitors, but that is better than being class traitors. We must support socialist movements and states, not only in words, but in deeds and material means. The extent possible, we should promote workers' STRT1Ls along the global production chains. We must build an international climate and solidarity organization. The specific ways, and which means to use in the STRU asterisk, depend on the type of organization and the specific political situation and place. It will from mass movement to dervaction groups, from parliamentary work and civilian disobedience to armed struggle. We will be a minority, but an important minority. In our political work, we often feel war we are doing is little unimportant in terms of changing the world. However, there are no small struggles and small resistances. There are separate sets of actions and interventions that sometimes converge to force big changes. Any capitalist system is out of balance. Small actions can produce an avalanche of events. We should keep in mind that revolution is not a tea party. Capitalism will not just lay down. If our struggle is more than words, it will have consequences. We should plan and be prepared for this, on the personal and the organizational level. On a personal level, it is not easy to be at odds not only with the state but also mainstream society. There are strong forces, which aim to integrate us into the system, our imperial way of living. Our participation in the real estate market and our pension funds link us to the well-being of capitalism. The massive news media and cultural influence inject the norms and values of liberal capitalism into our body and soul. It can be difficult to maintain a clear-cut opposition to the system and accept deep economic and political crises are part of the end game of capitalism. And we should welcome it. The end game is not a walk in the park. On an organizational level, we will have to prepare for how the global THIRD-WORLDISM will develop in the next 2 to 5 years. What should our strategy be? How can and my organization, fit into the analysis of the objective and subjective forces of transition? What kind of support can we deliver? How can we best be a cogwheel in the big machine of transformation from world capitalism towards socialism? There will come a day. Let me end this long book as I began on a personal note. I wish to paraphrase the handbill, Her will adjourn a day, handed out in May 1968 at Towards a Strategy for the On to Socialism 361 Burmeister and Wayne's Shipyard in Copenhagen ** Rexer that in many ways share the course for my political trajectory. The handbill states that the mobilization and transformation of the working class in the capitalist metropolis into a revolutionary force requires a crisis, and the working class needs to really end that radical change is necessary. Only then can we undertake struggles for emancipation. Lenin revolution is impossible without a nationwide crisis affecting the exploited, the exploiters. It follows that, a revolution to take it that a majority of should fully realize that revolution is necessary, and they should be prepared die for it. Unless blindfolded by illusions or dogmatism, no one will maintain that the majority of the working class of the global north is prepared to die for the socialist revolution. Rather, the majority are prepared, if not to die, then to STRT1 to defend their imperial mode of living. This has been the case since the end of the Second World War, and it will be like this for some time to come. How will the global North working class react when, because of for the emancipation of the oppressed nations and people, the imperial mode of living is no longer possible? We have seen racism and right-wing populism spreading in Europe and North America in the past decades. When the middle class comes under pressure, it often moves to the right, and social democrats have a historical record of allying with capital during crises. This might lead to military intervention against emerging socialism in the global south, in an effort to reconstruct imperialist dominations. Seldom has someone here the bull's eye better than Eichmann when he wrote, "How has this come about?" The answer is, as Engels wrote, the northern workers have gladly taken their share of the booty from the exploitation of colonized peoples. The British Prime Minister Disraeli, who was the champion of imperialism and defended the right of the superior races to subjugate inferior ones, extended suffrage to the popular classes in Britain in exchange for their support for colonial expansion. In this way, he defused the social question and class struggle in his own country. I say with that the great body of the working class of England, are English to the core, are for maintaining the greatness of the King Empire. TSME of being of and members of such in the popular masses respond to the dominant classy social reforms with patriotism and support for colonial expansionism. Lauesen writes, however progressive in its LR, there is no class that cannot be integrated into a OFA conservative or reactionary stamp. Is not a phenomenon, but has been and acquired a new qualitative in of disenchantment at the results of 20th century revolutions and subsequent TLWO. Marx and Engels pointed to the connection between social reform and colonialism. Lenin extended the critique but the social democratic and communist parties of Western Europe kept silent about it. War have the social democrats done instead? They have been working for reforms, for shorter working hours, longer holidays, bigger unemployment subsidies, etc. What have the communists been doing? They have raised demands for still higher wages, still longer holidays, still higher unemployment subsidies, etc. The Social Democrats have been boasting of the results achieved. The Communists have been saying that these results were too small. Are wrong. Imperial socialism will not lead to socialism. Lenin explained why, only Fetman which maintain off society. Bring about the revolution. However, as a result of extensive colonial poishi. EUFIM for SHFINA it is the of the natives in the Charmaine reigns the whole of Suisse, L and certain rise this provides the material and economic basis for infecting the proletariat with social democrats and communists have been joining hands in making the workers believe Chad IR is the working class itself, through #, that has made the welfare state possible. It is, but it is also based on imperialism. Lenin called it a parasite state. However, it is important to remember that the parasite state theory is not only a state that the working class gains from the bourgeoisification was a historical phenomenon, created by specific historical, economic, and political development in capitalism, and since it is an historical phenomenon, it opens up the possibility of change in the position of the class. The parasite state theory states that the working class in Western Europe and North America occupies a dual position. They are an object of exploitation, as they perform wage labor, which creates surplus value and thus profit for capital. However, by virtue of their relatively high wages, they are also able to acquire value through their consumption of goods, produced by low-wage labor in the global south. Whether they are exploited or exploiter, in a global perspective, it is a matter of a balance between the acquisition of value through consumption exploitation and their contribution of surplus value to capital. Without this double perspective on the position of the working class, the parasite state theory becomes static and loses its revolutionary content. This theory can explain both the historical process of bourgeoisification and the working class support for colonialism and imperialism through the 20th century. At the same time, it also maintains the future possibility of this class as the grave years of capitalism. If one denies the significance and consequences of imperialism's transfusion of value to the working class in the global north, one falls into the fog of seeing every economic struggle as a revolutionary struggle on the road to socialism. If one denies that the highly paid worker in the imperialist countries produces value, surplus value, and profit, then you reject the possibility that the working class in the imperialist center can play a role in the against capitalism. Moreover, one loses sight of political activity in the global north, and gives up the task set by Lenin, to seek, find determine the specific path or the proof that will to wall, decisive waliashi orvary struggle such is main objective of communism in Europe and in America. The hallmark of a Marxist is to have an analysis, strategy, and praxis for the context in which one is situated. Any communists in the global north must include the anti-imperialist struggle, and thereby the struggle against their own state's imperialism, as a centerpiece in their strategy. The success of this task depends on their courage and their fighting spirit, on how deep into the quagmire of chauvinism and imperialism the working class can do battle. When imperialism is defeated in the global south, and the working class in the center once again faces only their own bourgeoisie, then they may overthrow the exploiters. Global socialism. The only possible socialism needs intervention from both South and North. The New World Order will emerge from fiery straw #. The stakes are high. Will the system self-destruct by catastrophe? Will we slide further into global apartheid under fascist rule? Or will strong anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist movements emerge? 27.